Darkly Sweet, Part 2 of 3, by Juliann Whicker, chapters 15 to 27. Darkly Sweet, chapter 15. Written by Juliann Whicker, narrated by Juliann's clone and her AI assistant, Antoni. Which? My days fell into a pattern. Waking up early to put together some potions, running to class, seeing Drake in Past to Do and Business, Zach in Linguistics and Dressage, and Vine in History. I put the whole tower thing out of my head and didn't spend any more time trying to understand Drake. What did I care if he seemed conflicted? Like he was several different personalities. The big bad wolf walked around the halls, saying something cruel and cutting, then he'd smile at someone and be really nice for no apparent reason. It didn't matter if he had a real personality disorder, or if he just liked messing with people. Either way, at the end of the week, I hadn't talked to him since the tower and was ecstatic that he no longer invaded my personal space. At the end of business class on Friday, I was putting away my books and not looking at him, completely unaware of the way his jacket formed over his broad shoulders and strong back. He always ignored me in that class, for mysterious reasons I couldn't possibly fathom with my cute little bubblegum brains. "Penny Lane, what are you doing over the weekend?" I inhaled sharply before I looked up at him. I didn't have to force a brilliant smile. "Nothing. I'm going to stay in my room all weekend, order pizza, and not see anyone. What about you?" I stood up and got my books organized. His lips lifted in a snarl. "You're hiding." He moved closer, brushing my leg with his as he pressed me back against the edge of my desk. He was so close, I could feel the warmth of him against my bare legs, and my skirt felt very short. I swallowed hard and found my smile slipping. "I have things to do." I put my hands against his chest and pushed, but he only leaned his fascinating contours into my palms. He spoke in a low voice. "You're not going to invite me to a tea party?" I swallowed and shook my head while my fingers curled around his lapels instead of pushing him away. "You're developing a reputation for doing things without thinking." He raised an eyebrow while his focus shifted from my eyes to my lips. It's balanced more or less by all the things I think about that I don't do. He stepped back, ripping his jacket out of my fingers before he left the room, moving so quickly it almost seemed like he was running. I unwrapped a dirt-tasting lollipop while I headed to history. I was jostled and knocked into walls, had my books pulled out of my hands to the ground, my hair pulled and my arms pinched before I made it to class, heart still pounding, although it had nothing to do with Drake's thighs pressed against mine. I slid into a seat and didn't notice Viney until she said something stupid about how gross those people were to live with fleas, like it was an issue of intelligence instead of circumstance. In spite of Professor Vale's excellent lesson, I had no idea what it had been about when, after class, Viney passed me a note. I ignored it, leaving it behind me on the desk. I'd waited until everyone else had left the class, staring at that white slip of paper before I stood, packed up my books, smiled brightly at Professor Vale, and headed to my room. Halfway there, I saw a guy hobbling along on crutches, a guy who looked remarkably like my missing linguistics partner. "Barry? What happened? Did you really get involved with a mob boss's wife? Oh, you must have taken out a loan from the loan shark to pay for your mother's funeral?" He glanced up at me, and his face was swollen, his brown eyes nearly closed over. I walked a few steps closer to him before I stopped again. "Penny," he said through split lips, "I hope you're having all sorts of sordid affairs in linguistics without me." He winced when he smiled. I shook my head and took another step closer to him. "What happened?" I held my lip between my teeth while I waited for an explanation. He shrugged, hanging onto his crutches. "I was involved in a mafia war between two rival gangs. There were multiple women I was trafficking black market furs for, and while it was strictly business, their husbands were convinced that I was actually seducing them. He cocked his head slightly. There may have been a little bit of that. I fought them off, but when my ex-lover Russian assassin spy discovered that I'd been having an affair with multiple women, she hit me with her. He pursed his lips for a moment. Tank. Yes, her pink tank. Stole all my furs, decimated both mafia lords, and left me like this. I exhaled and reached out to touch his shoulder. Are you coming back to linguistics? There are so many missing details that could only be justified in the Spanish language. He gave me a half smile before he shook his head, looking away. I stood there for a moment before I let my hand drop. A tank? A green tank? He looked at me, his eyes sharp. No, pink. Didn't I say that? I nodded and licked my lips. I pulled a lollipop out of my bag and stared at it. Can I give you a lollipop? I'll unwrap it for you. He stared at me for a long time before he shook his head, a slight movement that sent a spike of pure fury through me. I don't think it's a good idea for me to be addicted to your drug-laced lollipops. I'll see you around Penny Lane. I stood there and watched him hobble away. Someone had to do something about his Russian spy mistress and her green tank. Okay, soccer mom car. I'd seen Drake break Jackson's arm. Who else would hurt Barry for absolutely no reason? By the time I made it to my room, I could barely keep from screaming. I entered the common room of lilac stories and froze. My door was gone. Not open. Not ajar, but gone including the door frame. Black scorch marks on the lilac-colored wall around it. I dropped my bag and ran into the room, crunching over the broken glass that littered the floor along with shredded clothing. Zach was in the middle of the room and swung around with a bat ready on his shoulder before he came up short. What are you doing here? Didn't Viney tell you not to come? He stepped towards me, his expression intense and body language dangerous instead of his usual relaxed, lazy. I stood there staring at him until I heard a little scuffling in the corner behind my trunks. Senor, I called, stepping around Zach, but he grabbed my wrist, and then I twisted, shoved his arm backward, and would have dislocated his elbow if he hadn't gotten out of my way quickly. I tugged on the trunk, sliding on the glass while I crouched down. Come on, Mort. It's okay. I know you're scared. But it's going to be all right. Come here. A flash of russet and a pair of beady eyes were all I saw before it scrambled along my arm and hid itself in my hair, curling around my shoulders and nudging my neck with his cold nose. I stood slowly, then turned to Zach. I couldn't smile, so I looked away, at the walls spray-painted nasty words I didn't know very well, at all my tubes and vials shattered, at my bed ripped out of the ceiling and broken up, at the only thing left standing. The trunks? I chased them out before they could get into your trunks. Zach lowered the bat and crossed one well-muscled arm over his stomach. I asked Viney to keep you away until I got maintenance in here. I tried for a smile, but my lips were trembling. Thanks. I can't. I looked around for a lollipop, but my latest batch was nothing but shattered red bits ground into the floor. Why don't you wait in my room? Come on. I shook my head and stumbled away from him, rubbing my arms. I'm fine. I mean, everything will have to be replaced, but it's just stuff. Senior Mort is fine. I think I'll take a walk. He hasn't been able to get out since we've come here. The woods are so beautiful. I turned and left the room, picking up my bag on the way through the pale lilac commons, while Senior Mort dug his little claws into my skin. I walked through the pillared halls and out onto the green, past all the students who watched me with terrible anticipation on their faces. They knew about my room. They wanted to see me react, see me break and shatter into a million pieces. I stopped and stood there for a moment, clenching and unclenching my fists while a few students close to me edged away, fear tinging their faces. I dug through my bag and found a bright pink lollipop I'd been saving for a special occasion just like this. I unwrapped it slowly, the edges of the cellophane sliding against my fingertips until I put the lollipop on my tongue, swirling it around until my heart sped up, blood pumping while I continued walking across the grass, swishing my skirt as I walked, eyeing every guy I saw with my most seductive, "Lollipop, look!" I gave girls the same glance because it didn't make any difference. None of them mattered. Nothing mattered in this stupid little world. I kept walking through the garden until I came to an iron fence 8 feet high. I didn't hesitate, but scaled it. Glad it wasn't electric before I jumped off the top and landed in my stupid shoes. I slipped them off, tucked them in my bag, shifted it on my shoulder, stroked Senior Mort a few times, and then started running. There were narrow deer trails that wove through the woods, and I followed them, running in my socks over the spongy earth. While my heart pounded, the concoction in my mouth entered my bloodstream. I ran faster and faster, pushing my body until my mind couldn't process, until all the pain inside was replaced by the pain in my muscles, my legs screaming. I ran until my legs collapsed and I fell forward, spread fingers catching on layers of moldy leaves, but gladly not on top of Senior Mort. I lay there on my face, hands outstretched, legs askew until I felt Senior's little nose on my ear, then my cheek. I curled up on my side, wrapping my arms around my little weasel, and pressed my forehead against his while the pain I'd been trying to outrun pounced and devoured me. Poppy had died on a day like this. Sunshine, running through the woods, coming back to the house and seeing her motorcycle in the driveway. I'd run inside, eager to tell her what an idiot she'd been to leave with some uncouth blackguard, and seen her perched on the edge of the balcony, 3 stories up. She'd looked at me and smiled, like she'd been waiting for me, and then she leaned forward like she was going to fly away, and fell instead. I hadn't even had time to scream while she tumbled through the air, her long golden hair rippling before she came to a sudden jerk on top of the unknown soldier's spear. The bronze statue had always been in the hall, but I'd never really noticed it until the mounted soldier carried my cousin on his shoulder, blood running over the aged bronze and dripping to the floor. I curled into a tighter ball while I hurt, and the pain didn't seem to have anywhere to go. I ached with a fullness of the grief, the agony, the loneliness, all the emotions I'd never felt not like this. I hadn't cried at the small service we'd had for my cousin, just me, Revere, and the priest before we buried her in the backyard. "Why were you so stupid?" I muttered, my lips gritty and specked with leaves. "Why would you trust someone on the outside? Why would you give your heart to someone like that?" Why? I smashed my fist against the earth, the pain rushing up my arm and dulling some of the ache in my chest. I slammed my fist again and again and again and again until someone grabbed it. I shuddered, trying to control myself to keep the panic and anger in check. If it was Zach, I couldn't dislocate his elbow or break his neck, or light him on fire and hope the whole world burned. He was a nice boy, and I was going to marry him. Penny? I sat up and stared at Drake in the dim light of the deep woods. "What are you doing here?" Seriously, the last person in the world I wanted to see. And he dared look like that, dangerously delectable in the shadowed woods with that hair and his green eyes dripping with fox concern. He shrugged and glanced away, and then back at me. I was in chemistry club when I heard some yelling, so I thought I'd find out if we had a new banshee in the woods. Turns out it was just you. I opened my mouth to say something, but only a sob came out. His mouth twisted in disgust. Finally, he could see how revolting I was. Fine. Good. I didn't want Drake to see anything other than vomit when he looked at me. I wiped my nose on my arm and left a long line of snot. My makeup would be streaked with leaves and dirt in it. Fine. I wanted him to see vomit, snot, and dirt when he looked at me. I caught my trembling lower lip in my teeth while I stared down at the leaves. "Now you know, it's just me, so you can go back to chemistry club. Sounds super fun. Run along." He put his hand on my shoulder. I'd completely forgotten about Senior Mort. Drake pulled back with a gasp, pressing his now bleeding hand with his other one. The smell of blood and black cherry filled the air. I closed my eyes and clenched my fists. When are you going to learn your lesson about grabbing girls? He laughed. Low, the sound a caress to my senses. I opened my eyes wide to stare at him. He watched the red blood well from his hand before he bent his head and covered it with his lips. I turned away, rubbing my chest. He made it look good. Like a wolf licking his wounds, which reminded me of him licking my fingers. I never should have let that happen. My fingers tingled even though I knew perfectly well that he'd be just as happy licking me as he would be breaking a bone. Here. He held a handkerchief over my shoulder, like he wasn't worried about being bitten again. I stared at the fluttering white fabric, at the embroidered heart slashed through the center, a broken heart. He was giving me a broken heart. I wiped off my face with his handkerchief, smearing it with my subtle and natural-looking makeup along with the dirt and leaves. And the snot. I had a lot of snot and blew my nose shamelessly, loudly and repeatedly. Is this yours? I turned my head to glare at him over my swollen nose. He picked up my lollipop covered in leaves and dirt, rolled the stick in his fingers, and stuck it in his mouth. I gasped. That's filthy. He shrugged and tongued it into his cheek while he smiled at me, showing his teeth. Not as filthy as you are. This one isn't as bad as the last one I stole from you. Why don't you eat the delicious ones? Are you afraid that you'll get so sweet I won't be able to resist sinking my teeth into you? I reached out and snagged the lollipop out of his mouth and stuck it into mine. It tasted strange. He smiled a sharp smile at me, while my eyes widened, because I hadn't quite thought it through. His taste on my tongue. A hint of blood and black cherry. He tasted so good. I pulled out the lollipop and stared at it like it had betrayed me. You even taste like black cherry. Did I ruin the flavor for you? You prefer bitter herbs and dirt? I sighed and put the lollipop back in my mouth while I slumped over my knees. You should go. He leaned forward, mimicking me, and I noticed that his hand had stopped bleeding and seemed to have a much smaller cut than I'd expected. Do you know which direction school is? You're halfway to town, and it's going to be dinner time soon. Something hungry is going to eat you, if you don't gobble him up first. I shrugged. I'll be fine. Maybe you will. You don't exactly seem fine, but I'm sure that's just the dirt smeared across your face and your ripped jacket. Where are your shoes? I nodded at the bag, and he grabbed it before I could stop him. Not like I tried. I felt kind of numb and kind of horrible, in spite of the lollipop. He stood up and slung the bag over his shoulder. I half expected him to leave me there, but he put out a hand expectantly, his green eyes gazing at me until I put my hand in his and let him pull me to my feet. I stood there, past numbness, while he brushed leaves off me, kind of careful, pulling his hands back any time he saw a flash of Senior Mort. When he bent down to brush off my legs, hands sliding over my bare skin, I stepped back quickly. It's okay. I think you scraped your knee, and it was looking so good. Do you think so? I sounded more skeptical than flirtatious. I couldn't remember what I was supposed to sound like. He looked up at me, for a moment caught his bottom lip in his teeth before he flashed his toothy white grin. Your legs are the first thing I noticed about you, or maybe your hair. You know that you have incredible legs. That's why you wear such short skirts and bounce, so it flips up just enough to drive every male here insane. I blinked at him. You're blaming your insanity on my legs. You should break them, smash my face in, make me a little less attractive, so you don't notice me so much. Like he'd smashed Barry. He raised an eyebrow like I'd suggested something seductive. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not into hurting girls, at least not physically. I'm perverted that way, sexist too. You do make it sound fun. I shook my head and ran a hand through my hair, pulling out leaves and sticks. Fun! Fun! I smiled brightly at him and flipped my skirt. What else is there besides fun? I sounded completely hysterical. I didn't care. He raised an eyebrow. Rolling around in the woods with a weasel? Screaming at ghosts? Who is Poppy? I stepped away from him. But he took a step closer, and his legs were longer. Poppy. I could barely whisper her name, and my stomach twisted into a knot. His green eyes narrowed, and he studied me with that look, the one that saw too much I was trying to hide. You were saying that name. You don't remember? I nodded while my head spun, and I twirled the lollipop over my tongue. Finally, I pulled it out and smiled at him. Poppy was my cat. She was my best friend, but then she died. I'm still super sad about it. This is the anniversary of her death, so I came to the woods to have a good cry. He stared at me for a long time before he cocked his head. You're pretty passionate about a cat. I pulled my hair back so he could see Señor Mort's nose behind my neck. Animals make more sense to me than people. If you think that I'm attached to Señor Mort, you should have met Poppy. We used to have tea parties in trees and sing. Did you know that cats can sing? They can dance too. I turned, looking around me in the woods for the first time. Where are we? Where is the school? This way. He grabbed my hand and started pulling me around. I winced when I stepped on a sharp stick that poked through my sock. He glanced at me, his eyes gleaming. I'm not going to carry you, so don't ask. I said through gritted teeth. My hand is too heavy for you, too. He grinned at me. It's not your weight that would bother me, but your red-headed guardian who would probably bite me on my nose. I'm very attached to the pattern of freckles I already have. I should have killed him for what he did to Barry. I wanted to, but I also wanted to sit down in the dirt and cry some more, and I wanted to hold his hand because in spite of how horrible he was, how much I hated him, my heart hurt a little bit less with his hand around mine. We kept walking until we stepped around a tree, and I pulled up short. The sun was sinking, but in that evening light, rays shone across a small clearing, hitting a waterfall and turning the spray into drops of gold. 2 enormous trees stood guard on the end of the clearing, arms twined together over the waterfall, while green jewels of rich moss dripped from their brown and silver branches. It looked like a fairy tale, and I half expected fairies to dart around us, or a talking wolf or something. I glanced at Drake with a slight smile I couldn't repress. He was my talking wolf. He raised an eyebrow, waiting. I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to fall into the fantasy, talk to Drake like he was one of my imaginary forest friends. Wanted to hear him say something clever and slightly cutting. I should have sucked on my lollipop and gotten back to Rosewood as fast as possible, but the evening in the clearing was too much for my stupidly overwhelmed self to ignore. This is an enchanted forest, and you are the wolf. I need to build my gingerbread cottage with lollipop windows and gumdrop roof to keep you out. His eyebrow quirked. This wolf only nibbles on witches. I can see you living in a candy house, but not gobbling up children. I smiled sweetly. You haven't seen me when I'm really hungry. He widened his eyes in pretended horror before he shook his head. Are you so hungry now? Am I in terrible danger? I stepped close to him until I was standing on his boots. He was wearing kind of sturdy clothing, leather jacket, and pants. I felt very underdressed and tried to step away from him, but he slid his hand over my back, holding me in place, my sock-covered feet balanced on his steel-covered toes. I stared at him, and my breath caught. His eyes sparked green in the light from the setting sun, while his burning hair tumbled over his pale forehead. I reached up and brushed his hair back. the silken strands in my fingers feeling like fire, the strands burning into me. I stared into his eyes while his hand tightened against my back, and I swayed against him. It would be the easiest thing in the world to fall into him and never resurface. Fall like Poppy. I twisted out of his grip and walked quickly in the direction we'd been headed. He hadn't been looking at me like he really saw me, saw everything about me, and liked me, not covered in leaves and smeared makeup from my tantrum. My tantrum. If there was anything worse than throwing up in front of him, it was crying, screaming, completely losing it. Drake kept up with me easily, and when I glanced at him had a slight smile, no sign of blatant disgust. You're running away like you're afraid, but of what? You're not afraid of a wolf, are you? I promise I'm very well-mannered. I wear hats to tea parties and everything. If you make friends with weasels, you should be perfectly comfortable around wolves. I swallowed. I'm afraid that you're going to tell Jackson all about how pathetic I am, crying like a little girl in the woods, like you told him about me throwing up in the parking lot. Jackson? He laughed. Derisive, cruel laughter. I don't talk to Jackson. Is that what you were talking about on the green before you sealed yourself into the tower? Throwing up? He really has no idea what to do with a woman? And you're trying to impress him? Why would you ever care what he thinks? I gritted my teeth and kept pushing forward in spite of the fact that every step made my whole body ache. I don't care what Jackson thinks. He's possibly the most vile creature I've ever met, like you without any charm. He barked a short laugh. You think I'm charming? More charming than Jackson, anyway. That's practically a compliment. Jackson has charm when he uses it. Something about you rubs him all wrong. I wonder what that is. Maybe because you don't need anyone or anything else. Maybe because you don't look at him and want him. Maybe because you don't need anyone's approval and he'll never have enough. I shrugged. I haven't wasted any time thinking about what his issues are. I'm not his therapist. He laughed. I see. What about me? Have you wasted any time trying to figure me out? I glanced at him and then stared straight ahead. His hand tightened on mine and I chewed on my bottom lip. You've made it impossible to ignore you. I've left you alone for 2 whole days. Have you thought about me since the tower when I rescued you so heroically? I sucked hard on my lollipop. I didn't want to think about that, to think about how easy it was to be with him, to forget what he was. Barry. Yeah. I tried to hold the image of Barry's pain-filled smile, but Drake was right at the end of my hand, and I couldn't think about anything besides him. I have thought about you. He looked surprised for a moment, and then smug. Of course you have. You've been wondering if I taste as good as your weasel says I do. Am I in danger? Are you going to grab me and taste me, finally settling the question once and for all? I laughed. I couldn't help it. Sometimes it seemed like he was as ridiculous as I could be. Of course you're in danger. If I were to kiss you right now, Senor Mort would probably sink his teeth into your cerotoid artery until you bled to death. Jealousy, you know. His laugh rumbled low as he smiled and swung my hand. You have no idea how tempting that is. Death by weasel? Can you imagine my epitaph? I rolled my eyes and turned away from him. You are so confusing. Am I? I'm not the one with a weasel boyfriend she likes to roll around in the woods with. I have a thing for redheads. Really? He drew the word out like he was tasting it on his tongue. And beady eyes. He laughed. And sharp teeth? Of course. I shook my head. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with you. I'm sure you'd figure it out after some experimentation. He waggled his eyebrows and I giggled. You're ridiculous. Are you really in chemistry club? He lifted his chin and said in a snobbish voice, I'll have you know that I'm the captain of the chemistry club. If you wanted to join, you'd have to either blackmail or bribe me to let you in. I can't see you responding very positively to blackmail, and what kind of bribe would sway you? All I have to offer is death by weasel. It's just as well that I can't stand chemistry. I stepped away from him, but he just followed me until he was walking very close, my hand in his. What don't you like about chemistry? My heart pounded in ridiculous awareness of him. Our chemistry. Of course it was nice to feel something besides the sadness, except that was exactly what had ruined Poppy. I shook my head. The names are so hard to remember. All those Polly. Mononitrates like fake popcorn butter? I licked my lips while I tried to remember what I had or hadn't said to him about it on my first ramble. Exactly. I tried so hard not to notice him walking beside me, his hand still in mine, strong, slightly calloused, warm. When we stepped out of the woods beside a road, I didn't even notice the thinning trees or hear the sound of cars until we were beside the pavement. A long black limo was parked in the grass, the driver standing beside the open back door as if waiting for us. I turned to Drake. This isn't the school. He smirked at me. The captain of the chemistry club can't just abandon his subjects. There should be food in the limo. Drink a lot of water because you're dehydrated from all your crying. Also wash your face before you get to school. Not everyone finds dirt and leaves as attractive as I do. He lifted my hand to his lips, kissed it, and then turned, heading back into the woods. I took one step after him before I shook my head and watched him disappear beneath the branches. Miss Lane? Mr. Huntsman gave me specific instructions. If you feel nauseous, let me know and I'll pull over at once. I walked over to the driver, studied him for a minute, then ducked inside. When I got back to school, I felt better. I was fine riding in the back of the limo, and after eating way too much food, I felt a lot more stable. I washed my face with a napkin in a bottle of water after I drank 3 of them. I fed Senior Mort samples of all the dishes, and he didn't drop dead, so I probably wouldn't either. At least not from the food. The shame, on the other hand, might very well kill me. Of all the people I wanted to find me curled in a ball in the woods sniveling, Drake was the last one on Earth, and what in the world did the captain of the chemistry club do? He must have seen me having my breakdown, called the limo, and then taken me to it. It had been really nice. He must be setting me up for an elaborately cruel and humiliating joke. I shrugged as I stepped out of the car. I walked slowly to my room, stroking Senior Mort as I walked beneath the pillars of the school until I got to Lilac Stories. Professor Vale stood in her black leather clothing, nostril pierced and hair spiked a lot like Viney's, but she didn't wear any makeup. Penny, have you eaten? I blinked at her, then glanced to the side where Viney and Zack stood, Viney's arms crossed and a petulant scowl on her face. I did. What's going on? My room was still without a door, but it was empty now, cleaned out, and a handful of maintenance workers were painting the room white. I was supposed to work all weekend, catch up with my orders, but with everything destroyed, there would be no way. I kind of slumped down while Professor Vale gestured to a room 2 doors down from my former domain. You'll stay there until your room is repaired. The wall has to be reinforced after the mysterious felons blew the door. She glared at Zack for some reason while he shifted uncomfortably, but managed to give me a slight smile. Are you okay? I smiled back and nodded. I'm fine. Professor Vale snorted loudly and scowled at me. You'll lie better after you've gotten a good night's sleep. I'm the new dorm mother. Apparently you need one. Take a bath and get to bed. I've bothered to fill the tub for you. She whirled around, a flurry of energy as she went to my room, barking orders at the men who flinched at her voice. I edged over to Viney and Zack before I whispered, What does that mean? That she's going to be the dorm mother? Viney fairly spat. It means that she's settling in here permanently so she can spy on us for Blackheart. This is all your fault. Zack nudged Viney and glanced over where Professor Vale stood. It's not her fault. If you'd been watching out for her, then we wouldn't need a dorm mother. I agree, though. People can't do this and get away with it. People? Viney leaned forward, poking Zack with her bony finger. Do you know who did it? He shrugged and stepped away from her. No, do you? She scowled at him before whirling around and went into her room, slamming the door behind her. Zack sighed, then shook his head slightly while he looked after her. I stared at him for a few seconds before I turned and went to my temporary room. I nearly fell asleep in the tub after I washed my hair. I got out, wrapped my hair in a towel, and curled up in the spare bed, piling the white bedding on top of me. I barely noticed Señor Mort snuggling into my neck before I was dreaming.
Chapter 16. Mage. After I left Penny Lane with the limo, I rejoined my fellow chemists in the woods where we played long games of steal the flag and not get blown up. I headed back to the school in the dark, fingering my soot-stained chin before I threw back my head and howled. Laughter shadowed me along with echoing howls. I did so love running with the wolves. Being interrupted by some insignificant witch having a fit in the woods was not something I loved, particularly when I was trying so hard to ignore said witch and leave her to another fate. I'd seen enough witch fits. I didn't have any desire to see another one, but someone had to go and make certain the witch's meltdown wouldn't actually melt down the entire forest. I ran faster, pushing myself through the trees cloaked in shadows, completely dark before the moon came out. I didn't activate any night vision. I liked running in the darkness. The risk of killing myself on a tree was so much more invigorating than your usual jog. Drake, you left this behind. I turned and slowed down to see a gasping Pete holding out Penny's bag. I'd taken it off and forgotten about it. Forgotten about her while I played. All right. I hadn't forgotten about it or her. I couldn't forget about someone who demanded to know when I'd stop grabbing girls right after her weasel bit me. I grabbed the bag and slung the strap over my shoulder while Pete fell in beside me. He hadn't played with as much intensity and focus as I had, sliding through the trees with explosives going off around us. No, he'd played at captain while I'd gotten all that irritation out of my system. Not all of it, but some. A little. Not enough. She shouldn't come into my woods with her large, tear-filled eyes, cuddling her weasel like he was her teddy bear, and she was some ridiculous child who needed to hold on to something. That was not the sort of witch freak out I expected, particularly the lack of anger. So much grief instead that it hung in the air like it would at a funeral. It wasn't my problem. She wasn't my problem. So why did I hold her hand? Why did I give her another handkerchief? Why did I care who Poppy was and whether Penny made it safely back to school? Viney had promised that she'd do better, take care of her. Viney should be friends with her, be someone she could cry with and talk about things too, instead of a mage in the woods when she was vulnerable, sweet, smiling at me even when she accused me of wanting to hurt her. I would never hurt her that way, break her legs, smash her face. Where was she getting these ideas about me? I reached the school too soon. I wanted to run more, wanted to smash something. I settled for joining the other mages in the showers beneath the Chemist Tourney Stadium. Are you going to Mackiss tonight? I glanced at the guy, Pete, who had asked Oscar the question, who stood, rubbing his black hair with a towel. Oscar was mostly dressed while Pete only wore a towel. Pete came from a family who felt that clothing was more optional than required. Oscar grinned. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Viney's going to be in fine form tonight. Didn't you hear what happened? I didn't. I pulled off my shirt and tossed it into a hamper. What's got Viney upset? Is it the new girl? Pete asked. Oscar laughed, a wicked sound that filled the shower room beautifully. He had very good tone. Maybe Viney blames her for getting a dorm mother, but I don't think that's very fair considering that the poor girl got her room completely smashed, doctor blown off, clothing, chemistry set, everything completely destroyed. I froze with my hands on the top button of my leather pants. Penny's room was destroyed. That's what set her off in the woods like a crazed weasel lady. "Who did it?" Pete asked. "Yes? Who did it?" Oscar shrugged. Zachary said that he scared off a few guys in masks, but wasn't sure if they were female or male. He's not saying whether or not they were male or female anyway. "Was it Barry?" Another kid joined the conversation, stark naked and blonde. Oscar frowned at the newcomer and handed him a towel. He was only a junior and shouldn't interrupt seniors, particularly without a towel. "How would that be possible?" The kid shrugged. "Otherwise, why did Zach beat him up so bad?" "How bad?" I stepped forward, remembering to smile at the last minute when the kid saw the look on my face. Broken legs, smashed face, really colorful, and what's more, Zach did something to him to keep Barry from healing. Oscar shook his head. "It happened before the room. They were arguing over a lollipop. Apparently Zach tried to take Barry's away from him." He rolled his eyes. He wouldn't be stupid enough to keep a lollipop that Zach wanted. Or maybe he would, if the lollipop in question was Miss Penny Lane, who had cried. Because someone had gone to her room, her beautiful woodland boudoir, and smashed it up. Someone had wrecked the swing I'd worked so hard to hang from her ceiling. No wonder Senor Mort bit me. No wonder Penny had been so angry at me, angry and then hysterical before shifting to sad, resigned, and then, strangely enough, somewhat content. Of course she was content after all. Why should she be upset when someone went into her private space and destroyed everything she loved? If someone dared do that to me... I grimaced and pulled my shirt back on. I'd shower later. I wasn't in the mood to be pretty for anyone, not tonight. I headed to the Macus tourney. It had already started when I arrived, climbing the bleachers up to the top where fewer seats were taken. I sat down, and other men from Chemis filled in around me, blocking out the females who were watching me rabidly. If I dressed well and had impeccable grooming, at least I could pretend that my looks had something to do with their attention. "You're in a good mood," Pete commented. I grunted. "Such a good mood. Remind me what a good mood I'm in later when I'm trying not to strangle a witch." He raised his eyebrows. "You're not serious." "Of course I am. When am I ever trying to not strangle a witch?" He laughed. "True enough." We stopped talking, instead focusing on the scene unfolding below us on the tourney field. Famus had a stage, but the witches needed more space. I watched the two figures down on the field throwing herders at each other, at the pop and crackle before the flash of bright light and shower of shrapnel. It was fine. The two witches were young, and this wasn't supposed to impress anyone. They wore their black cloaks and simply took each hit that got close to them, not bothering to duck and dodge. Their herders weren't terribly impressive either. I shifted impatiently. Our tourney would be much more entertaining. At least we'd have music. Why didn't Macus have music? Finally, one of the witches fell over, and the other was declared the winner. People cheered half-heartedly. But then Viney stalked out in her white mask with black cloak, a skull burning on the back. The guys around me perked up while I swallowed and clenched my fists. She'd said that she would do something about Penny. Letting her be assaulted was not what I'd had in mind. Viney took her place on one side of the field, while 3 other witches gathered across from her. Interesting. They began with magic, throwing spells and curses at Viney that she countered with her own spells. After they got tired of that, although who got tired of hearing a witch scream in agony, they moved on to herders. Viney's delivery was very good, the quality of her herders unmistakably fine, and she put some effort into moving around so it wasn't as terribly dull to watch. She split the 3 other witches apart, moving between them so they couldn't strike her without hitting one of their own, and she beat them deftly with beautiful strikes and thrusts that dropped 2 of them in one magnificent sweep. Someone to my left grunted appreciatively, and I turned to glance at Oscar. He watched the scene riveted, clearly fixated on Viney and her lovely violence. The other mages weren't quite as focused, but still, She put on a good show, and all of them would enjoy spending a little more quality time with her, if only she wanted one of them. The last witch held her own for a long time, their final exchange a flurry of volleys that filled the night with crackles and smoke from the herders. Finally, Viney lobbed a large ball and dropped down, pulling her hood low over her face as an enormous explosion wrapped around the witch. After a very long period spent listening to witch screams mixed with popping, crackling snaps, Viney stood, and the crowd with her, roaring their approval. She swept off the field without glancing around, completely confident in her superiority. Excellent. I stood and stepped out of time and into Darkside. I saw a black dog silhouetted against a red sky before I took another step and came out in the hall beneath the stadium. I stood there, arms crossed over my chest until she turned the corner and stopped, her face hidden by the white mask, but I could see the eyes, the bright anger in them. "What do you want?" I smiled. What I always want when faced with a tempting witch. Pizza. This time, I also crave justice. She walked towards me quickly, stepping around me and continuing down the hall. "What are you talking about?" I followed her into a room, closing the door behind her while she took off the white mask with shaking fingers and unfastened the heavy cloak from her shoulders. She smoothed it out reverently and laid it in its own box, like a coffin. "You allowed someone to destroy a room in your dorm!" She glared at me, crossing her arms. "I didn't allow anything. Anyway, what happens in my dorm isn't your concern." I smiled. "No? Did a mage or a witch destroy Penny Lane's property?" She sneered. "Zach won't say." I stepped closer, looming over her, although I kept my voice low. "You told me that you'd take care of it. I listened to your warning, stayed away from her like a good little mage, and trusted that you would do your part. You put up no precautions, no spells, no wards, nothing." Her eyes glittered at me. "I think that Jackson did it. You know the girls that follow him, what they're like. If it was a mage with witches working with him, how could I possibly prevent that?" I quirked an eyebrow as I studied her. I should leave her alone, let her get some rest after her exhausting battle. "You're saying that you need help?" She snarled at me. "No, I mean I can't control everyone in school. I don't cultivate a following of mindless drones who do everything I say. I'm not like Whitley." I narrowed my eyes at her. "I see. Fortunately, I do have a following of mindless drones who will happily do as I ask. Apparently, you are helpless and require rescuing. You're welcome." I turned to the door. "Wait! What are you going to do?" I hesitated, my hand tightening on the knob. I was leaving before I strangled her. "I'm going to be involved, close enough to not only discover and punish the culprit, but to keep her from harm." "How close?" I glanced over at her. Her face was tight, the question a subtle cry from her obsession for me. She wanted to know if I'd be close to her, Viney. As close as Miss Lane will let me be. Closer than she'll be comfortable with, close enough that everyone will assume I'm desperately in love with her. Who knows? Maybe I am. Excellent tourney, Veneldra. I'll see you tomorrow and the next day and the next. I stepped out of that world, into Darkside, and the same black dog with the same red sky. I howled at it before I once again stepped back into our world.
Darkly Sweet, Chapter 17. Witch. I was chased by wolves, all of them Drake, his eyes gleaming, teeth sharp and cruel as he finally caught me. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, but not afraid. My mouth was watering while I rubbed my head, trying to get rid of the sensation of his tongue on my neck. It must have been Senior Mort. I needed to get him another cage. I lay back down and had closed my eyes when a howl came from right outside my window. I sat up, rubbing Senior Mort's head where he curled on my pillow, and went to the window. There were bars crisscrossing the glass in a diamond pattern that was sort of beautiful, but also very strong. I wouldn't be going out of that window, and nothing would be coming in, unless it got blown off like my door. What had they used? I should examine the wall for traces of powder. Take samples, then track down who had access to it and what. Chop them up in bits and send them to their parents. So, someone had trashed my room. That didn't change anything. It didn't matter who had done it. What I needed to focus on were ways to protect myself and Senior Mort in the future, ways to get Zach to fall in love with me and marry me, and ways to get time to do what was important, namely, my business. I had a loyal following, but they wouldn't wait forever if I couldn't get them their potions and lotions, their healers and herders. Out in the darkness, I saw a flash of something. I heard another howl and shivered. I pulled on the long lace robe, too elaborate and ruffled for anything other than dress up, and opened the door. I'd taken 2 steps when 2 other doors opened. Zach's and another door beside my temporary room. Professor Vale, wearing dark, soft clothing with her bare feet, toenails painted pink, glared at me. I smiled at those toenails before smiling at her. She did not smile back. "What are you doing out of bed?" "I thought I heard howling." "You did." That was Zach. Both Professor Vale and I looked at him. He cleared his throat. "The sorority group, the Macus, are hazing their freshman recruits tonight. I don't know if you were warned about it, Professor Vale, but it's kind of an institution around here. Are you all right, Penny?" "Do you need anything? Aren't you considerate? Weren't you the only one at the scene of the crime?" I frowned at Professor Vale. "Zach would never hurt anyone or do anything cruel. Please apologize to him." Professor Vale lifted a thin eyebrow. "I see. You trust him so much. I suppose you trust the girl as well." I hesitated before I gave her a weak smile. She took 2 steps closer to me before she leaned over, her expression stern. "He is not free from her influence. Try not to forget that. Now, back to bed." I went, but it took me a long time to fall asleep, with the howling and the memory of the big, bad wolf's gleaming green eyes staring at me. In the morning, I woke up late and felt groggy, weird, disoriented. All my clothes that I hadn't left in my trunk were ruined, shredded up, so that meant I had to find an entire wardrobe that weekend as well as order all the equipment for my personal lab. Luckily, I'd had my laptop with me in my bag so I could order stuff. I sat up and stared at the empty white room. I threw myself back down on my pillow, buried my face in its depths while I screamed. He still had my bag. Drake, the wolf. It took me a long time to get out of bed when I knew what I had to do that day. I did not want to see Drake anytime soon. I couldn't see him soon or I might freak out completely. How had I forgotten to take my bag with me? What was wrong with me? I was supposed to be cautious to the point of paranoia, particularly with someone like him, someone who broke arms and legs and hearts for the fun of it. Someone who gives a girl a handkerchief with a broken heart embroidered on it just for irony. I opened my trunks and found a lot of fabric, some interesting costume pieces, and that was about it. My sewing machine had been ruined as well. I pulled my lacy dress-up robe over my rose print bustier and ruffled panties. My hair would take hours to comb out after drying in my bed. Of course, I didn't have a comb, so I didn't have to worry about it. I opened my door and saw Drake walk into the common room. I gasped and tried to step back into my room, but then his face, filled with fury that he directed at Zach, made me hesitate. Was Drake going to break Zach's leg for no apparent reason? Drake moved through the room towards Zach too quickly. I licked my lips. "Drake, it's so nice to see you. I was going to die of shame, but at least Zach wouldn't die of Drake." Drake stopped and turned towards me, the anger in his eyes melting into something else. Something even more dangerous. I fumbled with the edges of my ridiculous robe. "Penny Lane, are you still in bed at this hour? I hope I didn't disturb you." His eyes disturbed me as he raked over me like my robe was completely sheer. It wasn't. I was almost certain of it. He kept staring at me, which was good because then he wasn't about to kill Zach. But my knees were getting weak, and I had this idea I was blushing in weird places because I felt kind of hot and melty. "Of course not. I hope you brought my bag. I need to order a lot of things, and—" I looked at his body, his t-shirt, his soft pants, no bag. "Are you in your pajamas?" He smiled at me. "Are you interested in what I wear when I'm sleeping?" "You're welcome to find out any time." Zach made a sound. "Penny, are you going to breakfast like that?" I glanced down at my robe and saw that the lace had slid off my shoulders, revealing the top of my rose print bustier. I yanked it up while I blushed. "No, of course not. I actually thought I might borrow some clothes from Vine. Is she awake?" Zach's eyes got large while Drake choked. "No need," Professor Vale said, sweeping in the doorway. She prodded Drake on the shoulder while she passed him. "The lady is not ready to receive suitors. Be on your way." She walked over to me without waiting to see if he backed out. He glanced at Zach and then back at me before he grinned. "Penny, I'll get your bag and see you at breakfast. I'll be waiting for you." With that, he left, and Professor Vale stared at me with amusement. She pushed a few large shopping bags at me. "Get dressed. You shouldn't stand around in that kind of negligee unless you're trying to seduce the other residents. You're quite the temptress." I yanked the robe back up before taking the bags into my room. It seemed like the robe had a will of its own, which was possible. My grandmother had worn it on her honeymoon with my mysterious grandfather. In the bags were 3 school uniforms complete with vests, skirts, blouses, pants, black Mary Janes, knee-high socks, and 2 riding uniforms with boots. In a small bag was a toothbrush, hairbrush, and some hair clips and hair bands. It wasn't a lot, and I didn't have makeup, but I wouldn't have to wear elaborate gowns until my express deliveries came. I got dressed in a sensible uniform, fixed my hair, and headed to breakfast, taking Senior Mort along, riding on my shoulder under my enormous hair. I needed my own conditioner to keep it from the unkempt, wild curls of an 18th century peasant. Drake was sitting at a table in the corner, but stood when he saw me. He gestured to me to come, then lifted the straps of my bag. I went directly to him, ignoring the looks and the whispers as I walked. I licked my lips while I stood there, hesitating until he pushed the other chair out with his foot, now wearing boots that were a little equestrian to match his jacket. "Sit down. Eat. I got everything so you can eat what you want." I looked at the table. The eggs Benedict crepes, souffle, plates of hash browns, scrambled eggs, and waffles. I sank down in the seat and proceeded to eat. I fed bits to Senior Mort when he poked his nose out of my hair. "You brought your boyfriend." I shrugged because my mouth was full. I ate until I felt a little bit less hollow. "Thanks for bringing my bag." I held out my hand for it. He handed it over, but held onto the strap when I tried to stand up, pulling me back down. "The thing is, I'm kind of curious, Penny, why you would rather that I think you're emotionally overwrought about a cat more than being vandalized and victimized." I stared at him, desperate for a lollipop that was in my bag. I also felt slightly nauseous while he stared at me with his eyes narrowing, and I started to get angry. I forced a bright smile. "I'm so sorry that I ruined the story. It would be much better to talk about the shocking attack, but I am much sadder about Poppy than I am about my room. It's incredibly frustrating that I'll lose some time, but that's all it is. Stuff. Time. As for what you think about me, you don't owe me your good thoughts, and while they would be nice, I don't expect them. I wish you hadn't found me like that. I stared down at the mess of mostly empty dishes. I should have plucked out his eyes and thrown them to the wild weasels. I'm not usually so emotional. It must be PMS. You're a woman. As the weaker sex, you can't help it. I sucked in a breath and glared at him, yanking my bag out of his hand so hard that the strap broke. His lips twitched and some lollipops fell out onto the floor. I bent down to retrieve them while he watched me, his eyes full of something dangerous while he struggled not to laugh at me. It was like he wanted me to eviscerate him, like he was intentionally goading me. I took a shaky breath and stood, clutching the lollipops in my hand. That must be it. Thank you for enlightening me. If you'll excuse me. I have tears to cry and men to hate. I held out my hand for the bag that he still held. He stood up and slung it over his shoulder with the remaining strap. I'll walk with you. I'm very easy to hate if you need a handsome, irresistible target. I exhaled, ignoring the way that people looked at me. Girls, guys, everyone watching me with Drake so closely. What are they looking at? I murmured. Maybe they want another show like The Time with the Malt. Or maybe they're waiting for you to go crazy and attack me with your beady-eyed friend. I glanced at him. Why are you walking with me again? Maybe I want to look at you and imagine you in that robe from earlier. It's easier to visualize when you're right in front of me. I stiffened, and at the same time my stomach tightened. Why do you say that? Why not? If your purpose is to shock and revolt me, that's fine, but you're calling me good-looking, which I might find complimentary. So are you trying to attract me or repel me? Both. Maybe you don't know. Maybe you have no purpose other than shock value. I just don't understand you. Silence spread between us for a few heartbeats until he finally spoke. Do you want to understand me? I glanced over at him and then away. What I want isn't important. Why not, Penny? Maybe it's the most important thing of all. I stopped for a moment. What did I want? I wanted to run away from here and my family and never have to deal with any of them ever again. I wanted to hide from the memories of Poppy and the knowledge that if I didn't marry somebody, anybody. My mother certainly wasn't particular I'd be responsible for at best, making my mother homeless. At worst, killing her if she still refused to leave the house. I wanted to scream and scream and scream until the sound had shattered all the things in my life that didn't make sense. Most importantly, I didn't want to become worse than my mother, someone who had sacrificed her life for mine. If I couldn't do that, marry a perfectly nice boy in order to save her, I may as well light this school on fire and watch everyone and me burn, because there wouldn't be anything inside of me worth saving, worth redemption. I gave him my brightest smile. Thank you for reminding me, Drake. It's important to remember what you want, isn't it? I hope that you'll always be my friend. I smiled for the rest of the walk, swishing my skirt and looking up at him sweetly with my lollipop in my mouth. Lavender and dirt. I had to get moving on Zach, and Drake needed a different girl to play with. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 18. Which? How to get Zach to marry me. I thought about that while I sewed a new wardrobe. Sewing machine, courtesy of Professor Vale. It's not that I didn't appreciate the standard school uniform, except that I didn't. What did Zach like? Languages. Horses. Video games. All things I knew nothing about. Well, I could appreciate what he did know and cultivate some new skills in the process, like video gaming. It wouldn't be that bad, except that it was a complete waste of time when my time was already so precious. If I lost my business during this ridiculous mission, I would have a lot to say to dearly departed grandmama in the afterlife. Senior Mort perched on my shoulder while I hemmed my third identical school skirt, just a shade paler than the usual beige, a little more creamsicle than black. It was Sunday afternoon, and I was still waiting for my express deliveries to arrive that would restore order and peace to my life. Ha! Like anything in my life would ever be peaceful again. I stood up, stretched, tucked Senior into his makeshift cage, and smoothed down my flippy skirt and simple top that were still fairly cute. At least I had my cute shoes, and I hadn't ruined them during my woodland walk. Freak out! I flinched at the memory, me looking like I couldn't even think about it, and Drake rescuing me like a romance hero from some novel. Poppy used to read those. No wonder she made such poor choices in her life. Telenovelists were so much more inspiring. I stuck one of my last lollipops in my mouth and left my room, ready to sacrifice some precious hours learning the art of the video game. I sucked. I was worse at it than at horse riding, and that was saying something. It was worse than boring, humiliating, while Viney and Zach smirked at me while I sat there, dead for the 37th time, and they were still fighting each other, and zombies and aliens or whatever. Who cared? Thanks for letting me play. I'm going to dinner now, or else I'm killing you like a zombie alien bonbon you did not see coming. Zach bothered to look at me for a half second before he turned back to his thrilling game. Awesome. He was like a zombie. Boring. Why wasn't he running around in the woods rescuing females? He could ride up on his horse all gorgeous and stuff. Not that he hadn't been truly great with my whole room mess, but this was ridiculous. In the dining room, everyone was whispering, and the whole hum was very excited. My name mixing with Jackson, Drake, and someone else. Wit? I kept hearing it. Jackson and Wit, like he was trying to have wit, but had failed. But Jackson was definitely bringing Wit back to school, and he might speak mean boy fluently, but Wit, probably not. Sit with me. I froze while Drake grabbed my elbow, steering me to the side table. He pushed me down on one side and sat on the other. I think Jackson did it. I stared at him. He was talking about my room. It made sense, but didn't seem to match his personality. I don't think he has enough clever dialogue to be considered a wit. I stood up and he pulled me back down, impatient. He wasn't the only one. I did not need to think about Jackson or whoever had messed with my stuff, not when I didn't have enough lollipops to take me through another homicide-free week. Whitley. Jackson is bringing her to school because he knows that I know that he did it. I stared at him. That's nice. I'm so glad you told me. He frowned. Don't you want to know who trashed your room? I smiled. It would be nice if whoever did it was caught so they couldn't do it to anyone else. But it's not my job. He leaned forward. But whoever did that won't do that to another person, but something else to you. You're not serious about letting people walk all over you, are you? Because I can't do that. I stood up quickly, moving far enough away that he couldn't grab me and drag me back over to him. No one asked you to do anything, Drake. I appreciate your interest in the mystery of the bedroom debacle, but I have a lot of other things to worry about. Mostly stupid things like how to play video games. He raised his eyebrows. You want to play video games? With who? I shook my head. Zach and Viney and I think everyone else at school. I think I stand out too much, but at the same time, I'm cute, aren't I? He smirked. Very cute. So does the guy you like cute or something a little more. A silence descended on the dining room, other than a slight rustling and then a laugh. The kind of throaty chuckle a woman on telenovelas made before she declared that she'd stolen your husband and made him hers. I turned and saw a girl who could have stepped straight from a drama. Oodles of black hair in luscious waves, perfect oval face with a tiny pointed chin, and a luscious mouth that matched her large and luminous eyes. Her makeup was perfectly vixen without being quite too hoe. Jackson walked beside her, a smirk on his annoying face. Drake cursed behind me, a series of colorful profanities, that I tried to remember. This must be Whitley, the mysterious girl who had caused such a furor. She walked right up to me, glancing from me where I stood to Drake, where he still sat, sprawled back like he didn't care one way or another who had arrived, be it the Pope or a green alien. "Hi, I'm Penny." I smiled at her, but I didn't have my lollipop, so I wasn't quite as bubbly as usual. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe Zach didn't like bubbly. I needed a friend, a girl-type friend who knew what guys liked. The way that guys looked at this girl, she certainly knew. But the way that she looked at me, she wouldn't be sharing any helpful advice, unless it was how to light myself on fire. I already knew how to do that. "Penny, I've heard so much about you. You're the girl Drake broke Jackson's arm for, right?" Jackson glared at Drake, and his supple lips twisted, soft lips that looked a lot like hers. Did he Botox them? I laughed. "That's so funny. I'm sure Drake would like to give that impression. He's too cruel sometimes, isn't he?" "I'm afraid I didn't catch your name." "Whitley Penmore." "You look like you're on your way out. By all means." She made little shooing motions with her hand, and it took all my strength not to grab those fingers and snap them one by one. "I'm going to go and get my food, but I'm eating here. Why don't you two pull up chairs? It will be so nice to get to know Jackson's girlfriend." I left the three staring at me, feeling Drake's eyes burn into my back. Or maybe I was imagining things. Probably. I swished my skirt big time as I left Jackson and Whitley with Drake. Drake had better be looking at my legs, not some perfectly made-up hot thing. Not that I cared. I got everything carbs and rich sauce and decadent meat, plus a lot of salad and vegetables, and... Okay, I got a lot of food, but I'd skipped lunch trying to get my homework done and my stuff ordered and my uniform sewn along with current cute, if not quite as cute as usual outfit. When I got back to the table, there was an empty chair right next to Drake. I should have found a different seat, but I'd announced I was sitting there like a lunatic, thanks to Whitley's aggressive, femme-fatal vibes, so I may as well learn something from the experience. "Did you eat yet?" I asked as I settled next to Drake, noticing that he had no food. Would I have to share? He seemed to see the fear in my eyes, and a slight smile flicked over his mouth. "I ate earlier. I was just sitting here waiting for you to come in." He put an arm over the back of my chair, leaning over to give me a smoldering glance that made my idiotic heart pound. I gave a choking laugh, and then started eating. I realized that they weren't talking and glanced up to see all three of them staring at me. I chewed what was in my mouth, then gave a nervous smile. "You're so thin and hungry? Did they starve you at home?" I stared at Whitley, the barely veiled mockery in her eyes. Yes, they did. It was completely cruel. In fact, my last dinner home was herbed chicken, 5 servings of cheese, 2 souffles, a beef stew, along with the usual courses. How is a girl supposed to live on that? I've put in complaints with the local authorities. But minors have so few rights. I sighed heavily while Drake choked on a laugh and coughed, trying to clear his throat. I gave him a few solid thumps on his back for putting his arm on the back of my chair. He only leered at me. I restrained myself from kicking him under the table. Whitley laughed. That same throaty laugh that put up my hackles. She put her hand on my arm, and I smiled at her sweetly instead of stabbing her with my tightly clutched fork. "You are adorable. I can see why Drake is so fascinated with you." I blinked at her, then glanced at Drake before I gave her a particularly sweet smile. "It's the legs." Apparently, Drake is a legs kind of guy. Who knew, right? I mean, you'd think he'd prefer someone with a perfect hourglass body, immaculately beautiful face, and hair that just fell off the pages of a 2-spread shampoo ad. But no, he likes legs. Isn't that crazy? Particularly if you look at this hair. I shook my head vigorously. and my hair kind of fluffed out like an untrimmed poodle. Who can possibly predict what a guy's going to like? It's so bewildering. And there's the issue of if you want a guy who likes you as you are, or if you'd rather get the guy that you like how he is, and change yourself to fit him. Which is more important, being yourself, or having the one you want? I don't know. This whole experience is completely alien to me. I'm used to hiding in my garret and making miniature clothing for the rodents. Whitley inhaled sharply, while Jackson glowered and Drake's expression went perfectly smooth. I shrugged and focused back on my food, ignoring the rest of the table until I was sated. Not quite sated. I wanted a chunk out of Whitley's perfect face for dessert. I wiped my mouth on a napkin and stood. It's been such a pleasure to meet you. I hope I have you in all my classes. I turned to go, but Drake stood with me, sliding his arm in mine. So nice to see you two. Congrats on your new relationship. I hope you find it as satisfying as he does. Wit, he thunked Jackson on the shoulder before he walked off with me. I looked up at him, sighed, and shook my head. I should not let him walk around like he was my male escort, but that girl made me want to do crazy things like walk with Drake. He quirked an eyebrow. What kind of girl does the guy you want like? I have no idea. Maybe he doesn't like girls. I hadn't thought of that, but a gender switch for me wouldn't be too difficult. I would probably miss the hair, but the jackets for boys are much more interesting, and the vests and the sensible shoes. So you admit that you like someone? I giggled. Of course. I like lots of people. I'm sorry about that back there. I think my cruel, vengeful streak came out again. It's a lucky thing she didn't dump something on me that you were allergic to. I know you don't really like me or my legs. His arm tightened on me. Everyone likes your legs, even Jackson, who otherwise thinks you're an evil harpy. A bit redundant, since all harpies are evil, aren't they? I sighed. I'm not nearly as good at language roots as I should be. Why are people so talented at this school? He glanced at me and smiled. You've been here 1 week. Put these people in your world, and what would they do? I cocked my head at him. Oh dear, that wouldn't be very good. My mother would kill them all. Yes, she would. Even Revere, who was technically polite, had a streak of cruelty a mile long. I would never leave Senior Mort with him. He'd probably roast him for my first dinner back or something. No. What was the hardest thing about living at home? I shook my head. That was easy, walking past the waiting soldier every time I went to dinner. Probably just being lonely. Not that Senior Mort isn't great, but tea parties are kind of fun with real people. He nudged me, his side brushing mine and sending completely unnecessary shocks of awareness through me. I think that was almost a compliment, Penny Lane. I'll take it. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 19. Which? I researched how to get a guy to like you and came up with a few promising ideas. Very few. First, I had to do research. Find out his secret weakness, the one thing that was their key to affection. Their love key. Did he like physical affection, visual attraction, acts of love, gifts, attention, or appreciation? It was definitely a different way to look at attraction. The basic keys were a pretty face, kind words, thoughtful acts, small gifts, and gentle touches. I rolled my eyes and closed my computer. I would have to craft the key to Zach's heart over the next week. He'd shown interest in lollipops. That was either acts of love or gifts. He'd kind of ignored me during the video game thing. Maybe I hadn't given him enough affection or kind words or something like that. I hadn't apologized for almost breaking his elbow. I slid into the white, boring twin bed and hoped that it was the last night I'd spend there. The next morning was lovely. I wore my cute, customized uniform with a pink ribbon beneath my Peter Pan collar that matched my shoes. I skipped down the hall, smiling and greeting all my wonderful friends, giving them sincere compliments, validation, friendly touches, and beautiful smiles. They gave me mutters, snarls, flinches, and glares. Honestly, I loved it. I had no idea it could be so fun to be nice. When I walked into my English class, Whitley sat looking glamorous and glorious. "Whitley, you are in my class. I can't wait to hear what you think about pre-Raphaelite poetry." I patted her shoulder and skipped to my seat on the other side of the classroom, my back to the wall. She glanced at me a few times that I noticed, saying things in a low voice to the students gathered around her, evenly split between girls who wanted to be her and guys who wanted her. I concentrated on my work because I had no idea about pre-Raphaelite poetry. At the end of class, I hurried out, but Whit was already standing, waiting for me. She hooked her arm in mine and pulled me against her. "You must tell me how you caught Drake. He's such a difficult fish." I glanced at her before I kind of laughed. "He is difficult. The truth is that he's only using me so that people don't know that he's actually gay." I gasped and covered my mouth with my hand. I shouldn't tell you this. I should never reveal the shocking fact that Drake broke Jackson's arm because he likes him so much and can't bear him to touch another woman. I sighed dramatically, using the movement to take my arm out of hers and pat my chest woefully. The path of love never did run smooth. With that, I gave her a small wave and skipped off to my next class. After 2 more classes, I was on my way to linguistics when Drake sidelined me into a wall. He had his arms on either side of me, his green eyes dark and brooding beneath his lowered eyebrows, his sensitive lips in a hard line before he leaned close, brushing my cheek with his and whispering in my ear, "I can't thank you enough for agreeing to be my decoy, so no one knows how I really feel about Jackson." He leaned closer, his body pressing against mine, his breath on my skin making me shiver while my body tightened in the weirdest places. "You're so generous allowing me to use your body this way." He slid his hand down the wall until his palm was flat beside my hip. "I had no idea you read between the lines so intuitively." I shivered, and then, when he put his hand on my leg, right below the edge of my skirt, I shuddered, a wave of awareness shooting through me. His hand slid a little bit higher over my skin, and I gasped. He stuck a lollipop in my mouth while my lips were parted, stepping away from me, crossing his arms while he scowled. I sucked on it helplessly, trying to breathe like normal, but my heart was racing and I still felt his hand on my leg and smelled black cherry. I shouldn't eat anything that someone I couldn't trust gave me, but it was already in my mouth and it tasted like lavender and dirt. I pulled it out, stared at it for a second, then looked up at him. "Thoughtful gift or kind act? Did you make this?" His mouth tightened as he leaned forward, but his dangerous hands were still tucked against his chest, the chest that had been pressed against mine so very recently. "I am the captain of the chemistry club. I think I can tell what's in a lollipop, even one as weird as yours. You need that kind of lollipop even without cars." I put the lollipop back in my mouth and stared at him, letting my eyes get big and puppy dog before I took it out and gave him a wincing smile. "I'm sorry about the Jackson thing. I think Whit is bad for me." She starts talking, and then I start talking, and I have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth. I mean, I'm responsible for everything I say, don't get me wrong. It's just that I feel kind of like I want to. Jackson does like boys. I stopped talking and stared at him. He shrugged. He likes girls too. I personally don't like anyone, but you knew that. He slid a handful of lollipops in my bag. "Be careful what you say, Penny, because it might come back to bite you." He gave me a sharp smile, showing his teeth before he turned away, leaving me a shaky-kneed lollipop, sucking fool as I stumbled to class. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 20. Which, in linguistics, I edged over to Zach, where he was beside the Chinese flag in the little Chinese alcove, where some girl was pouring green tea in these really ugly mud cups. When everyone's attention was on the girl, I used the phrase I'd learned particularly. With just the right accent, something like, "Thank you for your help with my room. I'm sorry if I hurt your elbow." He smiled slightly and shrugged. His response didn't have any of the words I'd looked up for. No problem or whatever. I bit my lip and studied him until he shook his head and leaned forward to whisper the translation in English. It's a relief to know that you're not entirely defenseless. You probably shouldn't use jujitsu against someone with a bat, though. I blinked at him and nodded as I remembered the words he'd used. I definitely heard jujitsu. I accepted a cup of tea from the girl, giving her the traditional thank you I'd learned the week before, and then nodded and smiled mostly while she talked about her sick cat, or her sick grandmother or something. Zach wasn't in dressage, and Drake wasn't in business class. Riding wasn't as bad as the first day I'd been in class with the girls. I didn't fall off Henrietta, but I made the teacher come back and fix absolutely everything I did over and over, while the rest of the class glared at me. In business, I struggled not to notice that Drake wasn't there, like he didn't have to show up if he didn't feel like it, and apparently didn't. What a jerk. I thumped my leg where it still tinkled traitorously from where he'd touched me. Stupid chemistry! Stupid chemistry captain, and stupid me for wanting something so bad for me. Maybe it was the lollipops. Every time I pulled one out, my legs started tingling along with my fingers while I saw his eyes in my head, daring me to want him. Jerk! In history, I looked over, surprised when I saw Viney next to me. She glared at me for a second before it softened into a more neutral expression. "What are you doing after class?" I shrugged. "Homework." She took a deep breath and gave me a tiny smile, the first one I'd ever seen, and it was terrifying. I flinched before I beamed back at her, my smile chasing away hers. "Anyway, there's a really effective study lab that you might want to try. I can take you after class and introduce you to the Brainy Bunch." "Brainy Bunch? Is that like the chemistry club?" She snorted. "No, it's like the anti-chemistry club." That sounded promising. I'd had enough chemistry for one lifetime. After that, Professor Vale came in and spread her hand, capturing my attention like a magician. I loved her class so much. Learning seemed so effortless. Afterwards, I went with Viney out of the classroom feeling kind of nervous, because why would she be helping me? It made no sense. Then again, maybe she was anti-Whitley, and therefore on my side. I wasn't sure why I was anti-Whit. She hadn't done anything besides look much better than I did. But of course, I didn't look good. I didn't have my life back yet. I could look as good as Whit if I had the right makeup and hair conditioner. Wishful thinking. I sighed as we walked up marble stairs. Then more stairs in the enormous building that was apparently the library, and the study area must be at the top. I sucked on a lollipop as we went, our steps echoing on the wide halls with cavernous ceilings, dim chandeliers lighting the passageways. Finally, we stepped out into a large room with tables and computers. Papers rustled and people talked in low voices, an all-over buzz that seemed to stop when Viney's boots thudded across the marble, me following in her wake. She walked right up to a large desk that took up the middle of one wall and slammed her hands on top. The sound reverberated through the room. I wanted to offer her a lollipop to calm her down, but I wasn't about to give her something Drake had given me. It wasn't safe. Surely one of them would be poisoned or have a laxative. It had nothing to do with the fact that no one else got to touch something Drake gave me. A tall guy with very black hair that could use more shampooing came up to the desk, his shoulder twitching like he was waiting for Viney to hit him or cut off his head. "Oscar, this is Penny Lane." She needs help with her studies. I want you to set her up with your best tutors. I want her to try out all of the top 10 to see which one she likes best. Okay. She gave me another small smile that made me lean away from her before she turned and stomped out, her exit eliciting a breakout of hushed exclamations. I turned back to Oscar, who was scowling at me as darkly as Viney ever did. Maybe it was the only way to deal with brainy types. Sheer overwhelming domination. Hi, I'm Penny Lane. It's so nice to meet you. I grabbed his hand over the desk and shook it vigorously. I know who you are. Everyone knows who you are. He was sneering at me. Drake's sneer was somehow attractive. But this guy's was just annoying. I smiled brightly. Great. Well, as fun as it is to chat, I hate to waste your precious time. Let's get started. Fine. He turned around, searching the room before he swung over the desk in a not half-clumsy way and stalked across the room, his long legs still not as fast as Vine's vigorous stride. This guy and her would make kind of a cute couple, a study of opposites. Viney short and roundish, him tall and angular, but both of them scowling at the world adorably. Lars, Viney wants tutors for Penny Lane. Don't screw it up. Lars, a large blonde with blue eyes that looked rather vacuous, blinked at me, then after Oscar, where he walked off before looking back at me. Hi? I'm Lars. I waved at him and slid into the seat beside him. I took out my books and went right to linguistics. I don't understand the basic structure of Chinese. Every time I think I have a grasp on it. Soon Lars showed that he was indeed as sharp as the proverbial tack. I didn't have to look cute, and I didn't have to be polite, and it really helped when trying to understand something. He pulled out a little music player and went through it until he'd downloaded something he handed to me with a little headphone set. Listen to this when you're not doing anything else. It will help settle it in your head. I'd focus on one language at a time for a week or so. I can't imagine jumping into advanced conversational studies as a beginner. Hopefully the instructor grades you on improvement. He gave me a large smile because he was large. His face large, his whole body kind of enormous, not just his blue eyes. I stood up. Thank you. I appreciate your help. He stood up and started walking with me. It's my pleasure. I'll be here on Wednesday if you'd like to study with me again. Wednesday she'll be with Dude, tomorrow Orc. Oscar glowered at Lars, who looked vaguely confused instead of threatened. I left the two guys in the room where everyone seemed absorbed by their studies, but I caught a few quick glances. Maybe I should marry someone like Lars or Oscar. Zach seemed easygoing. He had to be to hang out with Viney, but he hadn't opened up to me about anything. Even in our horse lessons. Not that he'd been at my last one. Why did that feel like a betrayal? I bit my lip and unwrapped another lollipop Drake had made. Maybe he'd put something addictive into it because I couldn't stop eating them in spite of the risk of eating strange lollipops. I went downstairs, out the doors of the library, down the covered, pillared walkway over to Lilac Stories. I should have come right back to work on my room. The maintenance guys had been working in there all day Saturday and Sunday. I expected piles of boxes, my new bed, and brewing supplies, but instead I stopped in the doorway to the commons and stared at Viney, who was wearing a skirt. It was really cute, and she had great legs, if short, nice and curvy above her black boots. She had her arms crossed over her black vest and skull t-shirt. Viney, you look really cute. Doesn't she? That was Drake, seated at a table wearing a creamy cravat with a diamond pin with his black suit and black top hat. His green eyes glittered dangerously, and my idiotic knees went weak. You don't. Here, change, and then we can get started. Viney gestured at Zach, who I hadn't noticed until then stood in the doorway of his room wearing a black suit that was pants and vest over a t-shirt, without a jacket. But he also had a black top hat. He handed me a bag and nudged me across the floor towards my temporary room. I gripped the handle and turned to survey the group. "What are you guys dressed like that for? Is there a funeral?" Viney rolled her eyes. "I might wear a skirt, but I'm not wearing pink." "Come on already." She shoved me into my room. When I closed the door, I opened the bag and pulled out an outfit a lot like Viney's. Only the skirt looked suspiciously shorter. My shoes were platform Mary Janes instead of boots, and I had fishnet stockings and a vest with little skull buttons. It was so cute. A white slip went under the skirt, and the lace at the bottom of the floofy thing was also skulls to match the buttons. I dressed hurriedly, my fingers shaking from excitement mixed with fear. What were they planning to do to me? I opened the door. "Finally, can we get this over with?" That was Viney. I walked slowly in my platform, Mary Jane's, feeling really weird and so much black without my black hair. "Get what over with?" Zach gestured towards my old room. "We're having a tea party to celebrate your room being finished." I stared at him, his nice smile, and then at Drake, his smirk and eyes gleaming with wicked anticipation. I shook my head. "You don't like tea parties." "It's not really a tea party, although there will be tea, but I know that you need to eat about 5 pounds of food at each meal, so the catering will be a little heavier than your usual tea." Drake opened the door and gestured me in. Somehow the maintenance guys had managed to salvage some of my tapestries, and everything looked perfect, better than perfect. The shelf on the side holding my assortment of glass vials was curved like a tree branch, carved with leaves and small flowers in a way that wouldn't catch on my clothes. Everything was like that, carved intricately, like my bed. Hanging from the ceiling had an elaborately carved headboard of roses that matched the backs of the 3 chairs around the table. The swing on the far side had incredible silk roses that looked real and felt real when I touched them. Sounds played in the background, wind rustling and water falling, exactly how it sounded in the grove between the trees and the waterfall, where I was going to build. On the table, on my grandmother's lace tablecloth, a gingerbread house rested on a plate with roses carved into the pale ceramic edges. I turned and shoved Drake against the wall, covered in the tapestry with the mysterious figures that were either kissing or killing. I stared at him, my fingers curling in the lapel of his coat until they turned white, and I struggled with my own kiss or kill impulses. Finally, Drake pulled my fingers down and dragged me over to the swing, where he wrapped my fingers around the rose-twined ropes and then pushed me onto the bench before taking his seat across from me. "She's in shock." I never thought Penny Lane would be shocked into silence. Drake grinned at Zach. "We should have a tea party every week." Zach shrugged and sat down, pulling a tea cart closer that was heavily laden with food. He put a plate in front of me while Viney sat at my right and held out her hand impatiently for hers. I didn't eat right away because my heart was pounding and I felt so sick and panicked I wasn't sure whether I was going to scream or cry. I bit my trembling bottom lip, trying to control my reactions. This didn't mean anything, it was just... I stared at Zach, his smile a little bit shy, before he nodded at my plate. "Do you need a poison tester?" I didn't say anything, but Viney grabbed a chunk of meat off my plate and shoved it into her mouth, then Zach speared some vegetables with his fork before chewing on them. Drake winked at me when I looked at him. I quickly looked away, gripping my fork before I forced myself to take that first bite, which was always the hardest. The first meal I'd had after Poppy died. I blinked rapidly while my chest rose and fell. "You should have worn a shirt under your vest. I can almost see cleavage." Viney pointed down at my chest, which made me look down, and then up to grin at her. "I think you're right. Might need to get out a magnifying glass, but definitely a small trace of cleavage." I put a hand on my chest and felt my heart race, but I didn't look up at Drake. This is really a lot. Zach leaned over, resting his hand on my shoulder for a second. You haven't even finished the first course. There is a lot more. I smiled at him and tried to really see Zach. Nice, brown-haired, lazy smile. Sweet, easygoing guy I was going to marry, but my eyes craved Drake, and Zach's hand felt heavy until he pulled it away. The tea party went in kind of a hazy blur of clinking dishes, hot tea spilled on my skirt, Viney making inappropriate comments that were sometimes almost funny, and the gingerbread house in the middle of the table that I stared at instead of Drake. After we'd all eaten until we weren't hungry, and I'd stopped feeling nauseous, Drake gestured towards the house, the movement forcing my eyes up to meet his for a moment before I locked my gaze back down. Who wants to smash it? No! I grabbed the house and pulled it to me, protecting it with my body. Zach scooted back while Viney rolled her eyes, and Drake, who I glared at, grinned at me. It's for eating, Gretel. Don't you want to nibble on the roof? I shook my head tightly. You're so weird, Viney muttered, standing up. I'm getting out of this crap. Are we still watching a horror movie? I tried to relax my grip on the house, but couldn't do it even as I turned to look at her. Horror movie? Drake stood up too. Good idea. We'll eat the house while we watch the movie. Zach, is it all set up? Zach nodded, and I caught him looking at my legs, which were overexposed in my position, leaning on the gingerbread house. I bit my lip and tried to not act crazy. What had changed? Why would they do all this stuff? Fix my room and throw me a tea party. They couldn't really like me, not Viney. Definitely not Drake. What were they setting me up for? I reluctantly pulled away, noticing that I had white frosting on my skull buttons and the chimney looked a little bit crooked from my embrace. I stood there, staring at the house while Viney and Drake left my room, leaving me and Zach. Are you okay? I smiled up at him automatically, but as I looked at him, it kind of faded. I'm kind of freaked out, to be honest. I didn't expect all of this. I didn't expect any of this. Thank you. I put my hand out slowly and kind of patted his arm before I turned back to the house. It's perfect. Everything is better than perfect, just strange. He cleared his throat. If you don't want to eat the house, you don't have to. Yes, you do, Drake called from outside my room. Zach rolled his eyes and I smiled at him. It's okay. I will let the children gobble up my house, and I won't even cook you in the oven this time, but only because I'm already so full. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 21. Which? I carried the gingerbread house out of my room carefully. I put it on the elaborately carved coffee table across from the large screen, where they played video games opposite the big lilac floral couch. I fiddled with the house, running my fingers over the roof, the swirls of white frosting, the gumdrops along the edge before I finally stood with a sigh. Viney came out of her room at that moment wearing black pants, slouchy, comfy-looking, and an oversized t-shirt of a skull wrapped in flames beneath a long black sweater. She looked really comfortable. She stared at me dully. Aren't you getting changed? The tea party is over. I sighed. I have my school uniform and dirty laundry. I'm still a little short on clothes. I've never owned a t-shirt and my only pants are my riding ones. Her lips curled in disgust. You don't own a t-shirt. Why not? Why didn't I? They were too loose, caught on things. Were flammable and my grandmama disapproved of them. I shrugged. I don't know. No one I know wears t-shirts. At least not until now. What? That was Zach as he came out of his room wearing a t-shirt and soft pants, like the pants Drake wore the other morning. Where was Drake? Viney turned to him with a shake of her small head. She doesn't own a t-shirt. Really? He pulled out his phone and stared at it. typing in it while I shifted awkwardly beneath Viney's contemptuous stare. Drake's going to bring something. No! It's ridiculous. Is there a horror movie rule about wearing t-shirts? I am just fine in this outfit. I'm perfectly comfortable and just great. Viney narrowed her eyes at me. If I had to wear that skirt and vest, you have to wear a t-shirt and pants. You don't want someone to accidentally put his hand on your leg during the movie? Do you? I'd offer you some of mine, but you're way too flat and tall. I blinked at her. Thanks? Zach made a rude sound. Viney doesn't let people touch her stuff. If she actually let you wear her clothes, that would mean she was possessed by a demonic force, and we should call in a specialist. Viney sneered at him. As if I'm not already possessed by a demonic force. I giggled, and they both looked at me. You guys are cute. Are you sure you're not dating? Zach shook his head decidedly while Viney scowled at me. Zach and I have no chemistry, none. I could kiss him for 5 hours and only notice how chapped my lips are. He's like a piece of broccoli to me. She shrugged. I glanced at Zach, waiting for him to chime in on it. He shrugged. I've only been attracted to one female before. One? Really? Zach smiled slightly, blue eyes crinkling sweetly. Are we talking about who we like? Because I do not want to miss this conversation. Drake came in wearing a soft-looking dark green long-sleeve t-shirt with a V neckline low enough I could see his clavicles. Not that I was looking. He threw a bundle of clothing at me that I caught, dark clothes soft in my hands. Viney glared at me. Don't argue, just change. I'm making popcorn and I don't want it to be cold when we start the movie. Viney gave me a scowl, just in case I thought I should argue. But I didn't. Instead, I went into my room, my temporary one, fed Senior Mort, and changed into the knit top and pants that were rather large on me. The V-neck dipped much lower than my clavicles and smelled like black cherry when I pulled it over my head. Not that I noticed or buried my face in it for a second while I thought about gingerbread houses. Senior Mort. He is not being nice to me. He's just messing with me. That's what he does. He gave me the gingerbread house just so that we could smash it and helped fix my room just because. What was I supposed to do with the weird feeling in my stomach? Like butterflies. I came out of my room tugging on the hem of the shirt. I felt strangely indecent in such soft fabric. I felt much less naked in my lace robe. Maybe I just wasn't used to it. Sit down. Viney gestured over where she sat on the couch. Zach sat down beside her, and then I sat by him while I ignored Drake where he stood by the screen, fiddling with chords for a second before he turned off the lights. The screen glowed green as he came over to the couch, but there wasn't enough room for anyone else. He sat down anyway, on me. What are you doing? I gasped as his weight pressed me down into the lilac floral couch. I was going to die smothered in the most ugly upholstery known to man. Death by couch. It would be a good epitaph. I put my hands on his waist, trying to get him off me, but instead of pushing him off, my hand slid around his stomach over the soft fabric that barely hid his hard muscles. He shifted, and I could breathe a little bit better, but his weight on me still made me dizzy. The scent of black cherry making my mouth water. Drake hit Zach lightly on the shoulder. Move over, Zach. Viney won't bite, probably, and if she does, you might like it. If I sit on Penny much longer, I think she's going to take advantage of me. He put his hand over mine where they rested on his stomach, right above the waistband of his pants. My heart pounded against his back where he pressed me into the couch. I'm going to bite you if you don't move. You weigh too much. You need to go on a diet. Viney snorted. Drake is always going on diets to try and gain weight. He's the lightest guy in his weight class. I groaned and tightened my arms around him before I heaved and ended up falling over with Drake onto Zach's lap. Zach jumped, his thigh under my cheek. Hey, are we wrestling or watching a movie? Sorry. I muttered while Drake finally got off me, but instead of him going and sitting in a chair like a normal human, he sat down in my place and pulled me off Zach and onto his lap. I stared at him in the green flickering light of the TV, my heart pounding in my chest. I swallowed hard. I'm heavy. He slid his hands around my waist, like I'd done just a moment earlier. I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't blame it on his weight. He pulled me back against him, lifted his chin, and whispered in my ear, "You smell like black cherries." Do I really smell that good? How can you possibly resist me? Zach yanked on Drake's arm, and I escaped, making my way to the chair beside the couch with trembling hands. I pulled up my knees and frowned at the TV. Now I can't reach the popcorn. Viney passed it over, her gaze on the screen, which I also focused on instead of looking at Drake. Stupid teenagers were drinking and laughing loudly while they walked along a dark country road. The music built up kind of horribly, and a truck was coming along, faster and faster as it got to the teens. I flinched and gasped even though the teens somehow got out of the road, narrowly missed by the truck. I shivered and took a handful of popcorn from the bowl Drake held out to me, the green tint of the screen making his eyes look alien. I studied the popcorn kernels and ate them one at a time, the weird crunch not entirely unappetizing with all the butter on it. Haven't you had popcorn before? I glanced over at Drake, who was apparently still watching me. Of course I have. Haven't we had this conversation before? I go to movies in the movie theater all the time. I mean, I have gone a few times. Not a lot. Twice. Aren't you going to watch the movie? He left his hand on the edge of the armrest through the film, kind of close to me. I leaned away from him, huddled on the far side of the chair while the music got more intense. I wrapped my arms around my knees while I stared at the screen, my chin going lower and lower until I could barely see the screen above my knees. When the girl was standing in the woods, calling her boyfriend, she turned and screamed, while this guy in a mask swung an enormous chainsaw at her face. I gasped and grabbed Drake's hand, dragging his arm against my chest where my heart pounded, holding on tight while blood splattered the screen. I held his arm like that for the rest of the movie, probably uncomfortable for him. But I didn't think about that until the movie was over. I sat there in the credits, with a pounding heart, until I let go of his hand and straightened up. So that's a horror movie. I'm going to have nightmares. You're welcome to spend the night in my bed, Penny Lane. You can hold on to me as tight as you like. I glared at Drake, but I had clung to him through the entire movie. I glanced over at the gingerbread house and knelt down in front of the coffee table. I almost forgot. I hesitated for a moment, then broke a chunk off the roof. I ate the gingerbread. And it was really nice gingerbread, even if there was too much frosting. The gumdrops didn't hurt. Viney and Zach broke off chunks and ate while they discussed the movie, talking about bad directing, like who hadn't seen that chainsaw guy coming a mile away. Drake grinned at me, so I shoved a large chunk of roof in his mouth. He grabbed my hand and licked frosting off my fingers before I could pull away. My heart pounded ridiculously hard before he let me go. I shook my head and ate gingerbread until I really needed some nice tea to go with it. When the roof was gone and half a wall devoured, I stopped and stared inside. Written in swirling frosting were the words, "Come to the Fairytale dance with me. I'll wear lederhosen if you'll be my Gretel." I stared at those words while my head got dizzy and everything grew fuzzy around the edges. I woke up on the couch, Viney sitting next to me while behind her Drake paced, and Zach sat on the edge of the table, grinning and eating gingerbread. I squeezed my eyes closed while my head hurt. Viney yelled at Drake, "What did you put in the gingerbread? Are we all going to die?" He scowled back at her. "It's fine. She's just tired." Zach grinned at me. "Sleeping Beauty is waking up. Are you all right?" I sat up slowly while Viney quickly moved away from me. I put my hand on my forehead where a bump was rising. "You hit your head on the corner of the coffee table." Viney scowled at me like I'd done it on purpose. That makes sense. I had this weird hallucination that Hansel asked me to a dance. Wait, maybe it was a mistake. Where did the gingerbread come from? I looked from Viney's blank face to Zack, who tried hard not to smile, and Drake, who stared at me intently. I made it. Drake sounded almost casual. I stared at him. You made it? You made the gingerbread and the frosting parts, particularly the... He rolled his eyes and sat down on the couch beside me, too close so I couldn't breathe very well. Why not? It's not for another month, but girls have already started asking me. If I have a date, it's easier. I shook my head and winced because it hurt and my head was aching. Drake, as my pas-de-deux partner, you know that I can't dance. You should ask Viney, who probably dances really well. Or Zack, he'd be a great partner. You're even taller than him. Drake leaned closer to me, his eyes going wide and soft. He smelled so ridiculously delicious. My mouth started watering. I know it's sudden, and I know that you like someone else. It's just that I thought we were friends, and if you're not going with someone else by then, it would be convenient. You don't have to agree just because I made you gingerbread and frosted all of those little roof pieces, or that I hung your new bed and... Stop it! Viney grabbed his hair and pulled him off the couch. His eyes widened in surprise as she rounded on him, a small ball of fury that was pretty terrifying. She's just had a concussion. You can't guilt her into going out with you just because she's the only girl you know who doesn't melt at the sound of your voice. You asked her. Fine! I'm not going to let you stand there and try to seduce her into going with you if she actually likes someone else. And as for you, she rounded on me. I pressed into the back of the couch and smoothed down my hair to make it harder for her to grab. Don't you ever wear a bra? I blinked at her. That wasn't where I'd been going. Do you even know what a bra is? I gestured at her. It's for girls with voluptuous curves. I'm fine without one. She scowled at me. Do you think Zack and Drake don't notice your nipples in that shirt? I felt my face get hot while Zack choked, then burst out laughing. Drake stared at me, his gaze dropping to my shirt, while his lips twisted into a smirk. You say that like it's a bad thing. Viney whirled on him, which gave me slight breathing room. You should have gotten a shirt from the same kid you stole the pants from. Your shirt hanging off her shoulder and no bra. Zack put a hand on Viney's shoulder and didn't take it off when she turned her snarl on him. I think it's time for all of us to go to bed. Professor Vale is going to turn off the lights at 10, and Drake's got to clean up the tea party while Penny collects her things for her room. I know it's weird to see Drake acting like this, but you should probably stop screaming at people. She stiffened up and shook off his hand. I'm going to bed. With that, she marched off, leaving me alone with Zack and Drake. I stood hurriedly, then grabbed the arm of the couch while the world spun again. Drake moved like he was going to grab me, then held back while Zack put an arm around my shoulders. You got it. I nodded and carefully took his hand off my bare skin. Viney was right. Drake's shirt hung off me. Of course, Viney was the one who insisted I wear a t-shirt. Drake spun around and I heard the click of stacking dishes while I headed to my room. Alone in my room, I stood in front of the floor-length mirror, holding Senor Mort's floral-covered cage and staring at my reflection. My forehead was red, my shoulder was bare, and Viney was right about the whole nipples thing. The knit fabric clung to absolutely everything, and my femininity was glaring. Weird. I put the cage down and pulled off the knit clothing, throwing them violently to the ground before I rustled up my temptress robe and rose bustier. Fine, if knit clothes were too provocative, I'd stick to my grandmother's negligee and call it good. I folded up the clothes, burying my face in the shirt, and inhaling deeply of black cherry before I picked up Senor Mort's cage and stalked into the common room. Drake, I'm putting your clothes on the couch. Zack, could you help me move my trunks into my room? I didn't see what kind of security system it had. Could I speak to the maintenance team that fixed my room? Drake came out of my room, and I nodded at him. Will you help Zach get my trunks? Thanks so much. I stood back, lifting my chin and not quite looking at his narrowing green eyes as he stood there, hands clenching and unclenching. He leaned close as he passed me. You can't think that you look less enticing in your practically sheer lace robe and that contraption. You must be trying to tease me into giving you a better offer. Fine, I'll wear lederhosen without a shirt. I gasped and shivered, but that wasn't from his arm brushing across my body, sending a flare of bewildering heat through me. I didn't say anything, just hung onto my cage and tried not to faint again. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 22. Which? After everyone was gone, I sat cross-legged on my bed with my phone. I took a deep breath and pushed the call button. Penny. Revere. Silence stretched on the line for a long time before I finally sighed and muttered, I fainted. Details. My upper lip curled. After I watched a movie with 2 males and 1 female, I ate gingerbread and fainted. What movie? I shrugged, even though he couldn't see me. It was a horror movie. Cars? I scratched my chin. A truck. Lots of blood? I took a deep breath. Yes. 2 mages and a witch? I wrinkled my nose. You would say that. There was silence on his side of the line for a long time while he contemplated the mysteries of the universe. Any surprises? I hesitated. Yes. Letting your guard down? Probably. I scowled at the swing and exquisite silk roses above the wooden carved seat. How do you feel now? Hungry. He sighed. I'm angry, confused, frustrated. Also a little bit. The word was hopeful that somehow these people were my friends for real. I knew it wasn't possible for that kind of thing. So much changed so fast, but I hoped. Rosewood brats have ingenious ways of tormenting each other. It seems to me that your natural distrust for the mage was exacerbated during this intimate gathering. I advise you to keep physical distance from the opposite sex until you've secured a marriage. How am I supposed to do that? Secure a marriage without getting close to anyone? It's not as easy as it sounds. He inhaled long, loud, his sigh ringing with the exhaustion he always felt when dealing with me. You clearly announce your intention to marry a peer, and select one of those who come forward. And if I don't like any of those who come forward, if anyone did come forward, what does liking have to do with anything? You've romanticized marriage too much. I threw myself back on my bed and sent it swinging back and forth. Thank you so much for your help, Revere. What would I do without you? He made a rude sound that made me smile. Your mother asks if you've killed anyone yet. I scowled at the ceiling. I'm pretty sure if I killed someone you would have heard about it. He sniffed. If you couldn't get away with murder, you'd better not do it. I rolled my eyes and almost giggled. That is so true. Thank you for this truly inspiring conversation. He made another disapproving sound. Your mother says that the fainting is most likely from... I waited. What does she say? He cleared his throat. Attraction. Attraction? Not only attraction, mindless response to physical chemistry, otherwise known as love. I clicked off the phone and dropped it from my limp fingers. Macaroons, bonbons, petite fours, ho-hos, ding-dongs, eclairs. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 23. Which? The next day was great, if you call pas de deux with Drake great. His hand seemed to drift towards the top of my leg, although his hand was supposed to be at the top of my leg, and right beneath my breast, and his hands on my body while I was concentrating on turnout and not kicking the girl behind me, and holding my arms in a beautiful curve instead of like frog legs. It was too much. My conversation with Revere kept playing in my head. If I were going to murder someone, I should start with Drake. His eyes glinted green as his lips curved, showing sharp teeth. My fingers knew his mouth far too well. My heart pounded from being so close to him, from his scent and the feel of his strong hands holding me steady. He wasn't just the wolf who wanted to rip me to pieces. He'd hung my bed, made me gingerbread, and installed a top-notch security system with camera outside the room, so if someone blasted off the door again, I'd know who did it. Every time he touched me, I felt an electric current go through me that made the rest of the world disappear besides his touch, his scent, his wicked smile. I was falling for him after only 1 week. After class, he grabbed my hand for a second. "You're getting better." I gave him a sickly smile before I took off for linguistics. I went to the Chinese corner and stayed there the entire time, listening for patterns in language, the best way to respond, and in general trying to get a grasp on the structure. Zach spoke to me a little bit, but I felt awkward about it after the night before. How was I supposed to be enticing him when Drake acted like that, making me a gingerbread house and asking me to a dance? Had Zach noticed me holding Drake's hand through the movie? I still had no idea what Zach liked. He just treated everyone kind of normal, and people treated him a little bit like... To be honest, they kind of treated him with watchful respect. Of course, because he was such a brilliant linguist. After class, I followed him. Watching him, and while he didn't exactly interact with anyone, people gave him space and looked at him with that same kind of watchful respect. People threw their bubble gum in my hair, tripped me, called me a slut, a whore, and a lady of the night, which I really liked. Well, I spread love and cheer like a crazy person. After lunch, Zach was once more petting Henrietta's dark nose when I came in the stable. He smiled at me slightly while I beamed back. "How is Miss Henrietta today?" He handed me a sugar cube to feed her. "She's jealous that she didn't get invited to the party. I told her about Drake's hat." I held out my hand and tried not to remember Drake, dressed in that insanely attractive black suit, with the hat perched rakishly over his eyebrows. It was a wonderful party. "Thank you, Zach. Is that why you weren't here yesterday, because you were helping maintenance with it?" He shrugged. "I was keeping an eye on Drake. He can go overboard sometimes. He sourced all your rose-themed stuff, sent back the things you ordered, and found a custom woodcarver to do the shelf. Maybe he has a secret fetish about interior decorating. His room is nothing like yours." I licked my lips and glanced over at him. "What is his room like?" He shrugged. "Black mostly, some silver and white, but mostly black." "Do you know how to stop the woodland sounds? I had some really scary dreams last night, and only Senior Mort kept me from climbing into bed with Professor Vale." Zach smiled at me and led me around to Henrietta's left side. He held the stirrup for me as I mounted. Drake installed the sound system. You'll have to ask him. His room has an incredible sound system. If we watched a horror movie in there, it would be even scarier. His eyes lit up while he smiled at me. I swallowed and held the reins in my hands lightly. Happy thought. "Zach?" I hesitated while I got up my nerve. "Last night you said that you've only liked one female. What was she like?" He grinned at me while he led me out into the sun. "To tell the truth, I've liked a few girls, but I don't like to tell that to Viney. I don't want her to feel bad that she's not one of them." "But why?" "She's cute and kind of funny besides that. She's really good at video games." "Yeah, Viney's fine, but she's not my type." "What is your type?" His eyebrows lowered. "It's hard to describe. Maybe more confident and feminine while being strong, yet warm." like that helped. Do you like Wit? He laughed. It's hard not to like Wit, at least from a distance, but up close, she's incredibly cold. Viney has a tough shell, but she's not that bad once you get to know her. I exhaled in relief. If he wanted Wit, it was over for me. I like her. His eyes widened. You like Viney? She's the one you're trying to. I shook my head too enthusiastically, and Henrietta sidestepped, tugging on the bit warningly. I like her as a friend. She's fun. I feel like she noticed my chest way more than either of you, though. Why doesn't she have a boyfriend? Viney likes a guy. She's liked him for a long time, forever practically, but it's not mutual. What about this guy that you like? Are you just making him up to drive Drake crazy? I wrinkled my nose and tightened my knees too much on Henrietta's back. I think that Drake made him up. I do kind of like someone, but I don't know him very well. It's hard to get to know people at this school. Everyone is so busy. His face went kind of still before he smiled and nodded. So, there is someone besides Drake. Good for you. Let me guess. Someone you don't know very well. Someone busy. Could it be Barry, even though he's already gotten your sister pregnant? I laughed before the laugh died as I thought of his smashed and swollen face. The crutches. Linguistics isn't nearly as fun without him. Do you think he'll come back? He cocked his head before he shook it. I talked to him about it. He's not the greatest linguist. He only took that class because the one he really wanted to take was full. The other class had an opening, so he transferred. I nodded slowly. I guess that makes sense. What class is it? I'm not the greatest linguist either. He pursed his lips. He had very nice lips. I blushed and glanced away. He put his hand on my knee, his touch warm and careful. He was good with skittish animals, calm, patient, so nice. Advanced chemistry. This school is full of eager chemists. I nodded and held very still, half afraid he'd move his hand, half afraid that he wouldn't. He finally pulled his hand off my knee, and I exhaled. What about your tutors? I stared at Zach. My tutors? He smiled sweetly. I think that Viney is trying to set you up with one or all of them. I pursed my lips. I've only met Lars so far. He's brilliant. Lars is. Does he like you? I shrugged. He was nice. He smiled. The last girl Lars dated was Marilyn Schroeder. She's a really great dancer-singer and does a lot of plays. Very vivacious and fun. You're a lot like that. You'd probably be a good match. I nodded and tried not to frown. If Zach was so easygoing about me liking someone else, that probably meant that he didn't like me at all. Good to know. Except if he liked that, why did he break up with her? He raised his eyebrows. That I don't know. Marilyn isn't the brightest girl, so Lars might have gotten tired of her, you know. It can get irritating to try and have conversations with people who only understand life on a superficial level. Ouch. That explained why Zach didn't like to talk to me that much. My stomach churned, and I struggled not to kick Henrietta into a gallop and kill both of us on the nearest fence. I licked my lips and smiled brightly. That must be why you don't talk to people very often. Do you geniuses ever get lonely with all your deep and brilliant thoughts? He frowned. I wasn't talking about. It doesn't matter. Why did Drake ask me to the dance? Is it a prank? He cleared his throat. No, I mean, maybe, but I don't think it's about you. I think that he's just doing it to irritate the other girls. That's what he usually does. He wasn't always like this. He used to be really quiet, kind of shy before he became captain of the chemistry club. He glanced up at me. He told you that, right? I nodded and giggled adorably. He did. Drake tells me so many things that completely confuse me. To me, it makes sense that smart guys would be the same as science guys, But apparently the brainy bunch are completely different from the science club. Chemistry, not science. I smiled brightly. Either way, I'm so excited to go back to the study hall every day and interact with all those bright minds. Some of them might rub off on me. He grabbed Henrietta's bridle and pulled me up short. He looked me in the eye, his blue eyes intent, serious, kind of scary. You aren't stupid. Sometimes you're ignorant, but that isn't the same thing. I know that you pretend to be happy and cheerful when you'd rather burn something, but I like that. You make happiness seem possible. I licked my lips and let my smile fade. Is it? I shook my head and smiled brightly. Today I'm going to study with Orc. I can't wait to see what he's like. He gave me a sudden fierce smile. You're studying with Orc today. You'll like him. I raised my eyebrows. If you say so. What do you know about Oscar? I think Viney should date him. Wouldn't they be cute together? He cleared his throat. Very cute. You're not going to study with Oscar. He's the perfect blend of chemistry and philosophy. I shook my head. Viney likes him. There's no way she'd stomp her boots so loud or slam her fists on the counter so emphatically. I couldn't possibly like someone Viney liked. He spent a long time looking thoughtful while I rode around on Henrietta and managed to stay on her back. In business, Drake sat up near the front and I sat near the back, and then when I looked up from unpacking my books, he'd moved to sit beside me. I stared at him and he gave me a sharp smile while he gripped the edge of the desk with his hand. He had a ring on his middle finger, a gold band that slithered around like a snake or a dragon. I like your ring. He raised his eyebrows. Do you want it? I leaned my chin on my hand, desperately. Forget the fact that it wouldn't even fit me and that it would look ridiculous with all my outfits. Is that why you don't compliment my skirts? Because that would mean you want to wear them? He smiled at me slowly while he glanced down at my legs. It's not your skirt I admire. When he glanced back up to my face, I looked away. He stayed staring at me for a long time. What do you want? I asked, finally staring at him back. You. He grinned widely while I squirmed. I thought I should sit beside you in case you get scared during today's film and need someone to cling to. I bit my lip. Why are we watching a horror film in business class? He leaned closer. It's the horror of bankruptcy. Prepare to be terrified. I shook my head and focused on my own desk, my own books, but he kept shifting beside me, his foot stretched out in the aisle between us, brown loafers scuffed and comfortable looking beneath the edge of his navy pants. I stopped staring at his shoe and forced myself to pay attention to the teacher and then the video, but he was so close and I could smell him, black cherry and vanilla. But I wanted to smell more, wanted to press my face into his skin and inhale until I passed out in his arms. When the lights came back on, I took a shaky breath and smoothed down my vest. It was wool, and there didn't seem to be any show-through, but maybe Viney was right. I shook my head because I did not need thoughts like that in my head, not when I turned and could imagine Drake without a shirt. He should wear a bra. And 5 sweaters. What was with the double standard? Why was it okay for guys to have nipples but not girls? I stood up and left the room. Class over, but Drake fell in beside me as we walked down the broad marble hall. I'll see you at 5:30 tonight. I spun around to stare at him. What? Community service. Did you forget? His green eyes sparkled, mischief and something else in them. What? Community service, Drake? Whitley stared at the two of us like we'd just turned into dodo birds. I edged closer to Drake, automatically ready to say something stupid. He beat me to it. Wit. You're invited if you'd like to come. It would be great for the whole community to be involved with our local hospital. It's always terribly understaffed, and cleaning up vomit isn't bad once you get used to it. I beamed brightly while he nudged me with his elbow. Oh, Wit, do you think you'd like to come with Jackson? I had such a great time last week, and the hospital even has a cafeteria so you can get dinner without having to go anywhere. They have these amazing mashed potatoes that are freeze-dried and then reconstituted. Isn't that amazing? She gave Drake a large smile before she patted my shoulder with her strangely, sensibly short nails. I kind of expected long and red, vampy like a real telenovela star would have. You know how many girls would be throwing up in the halls of the hospital if they knew that Drake was the one cleaning it up. I'll do you the favor of keeping it quiet. Have fun, you two. She edged out of sight, and he raised his eyebrows at me. I'll see you at 5:30 for some community service and doubly amazing mashed potatoes. Don't argue. Just stand there and look pretty. What? He was laughing as he turned away from me, his voice kind of low and reverberating through me in a completely ridiculous way. I rolled my eyes at myself and smiled brightly at the next girl I saw walking in the same direction I was going. Hi, I'm Penny Lane. In history, I sat down and unwrapped a lollipop. Viney sat beside me, pulling out her history book. She scowled at the teacher and then turned her scowl on me. Did you give Drake your answer? I stared at her. What? She rolled her eyes. Are you really that stupid? Sometimes you don't seem quite as stupid as usual, but then other times you're twice as stupid as seems humanly possible. The dance, she hissed, leaning close so no one else could hear. Oh, I shook my head. Didn't I answer him yesterday? She raised her eyebrows and crossed her arms over her chest. If you are going to say no to him, you have to be a little more clear than fainting. He's not the kind of person who hears no very often. You should say no, just for all the pathetic girls who want him and can't have him. But they would say yes. I mean, if I'm going to represent the girls who like him, I would be excited about it and less nauseous. She studied me thoughtfully. You kind of like him, but he makes you nervous. I shook my head, terrified. He's terrifying. I nodded my head as I stared at my desk. It wasn't like the car fear. It was something else, something even worse. I should have control over it, should be able to not want someone, but I couldn't help it. My whole body and mind rebelled against my mandate, against falling in love with some guy who was going to ruin my life. When that guy was tall, lean, red-haired Drake. She sort of laughed, sort of snorted. So you don't want to go to the dance with him? I shook my head, still staring at the desk. I can't. You are so weird. Do you know how completely crazy you are not to jump all over this? I get that he's completely overwhelming you, but you like him. I can tell. I winced. If Viney could see that I liked him, then so could Zach. I'm not used to guys at all, much less ones like Drake, who made me a gingerbread house. She exhaled. I get that. He's freaking me out, and I'm not the one he's flirting with. There are so few competent flirts in this world. Have you ever dated before? I shook my head. Not unless you count pets. She snorted again. Pets do not count. We are going on a date. I widened my eyes at her. Really? You want to go on a date with me? She glared at me. A double date. I will get the guys, and you will wear pants and a bra, and have a normal date in town with people who aren't Drake or Zach. He's been acting weird lately, probably because of Drake. Are you sure you don't want to go with Drake to the dance? It might make things easier for you to be Drake Huntsman's girlfriend. People might not put gum in your hair quite as often. She wrinkled her nose and picked a chunk of pink gum out of my hair with her nails. I'd rather have the gum. She yanked out a chunk of hair before she rolled the pink hairball up and threw it in the garbage across the classroom. She smirked at me. I can't wait to see what Drake does after you let him down. I rubbed my head and gave her a slight smile. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 24. Which? After that, Viney walked with me to the study hall, and her encounter with Oscar was just as fist-slamming, ordering the tall guy around as the day before. They would make a cute couple. Orc was 5'3" and wore glasses with lenses the size of golf balls. Penny Lane, let's get started. His voice sent a shiver through me. It was so low and deep and frankly delicious. I smiled at Viney as he led me away and then spent the next hour and a half on chemistry, even though I kept telling him I wanted to do languages. Apparently, he was really into chemistry, even if he wasn't in the chemistry club. I shook my head. I'm actually struggling more with languages right now. I'm not exactly on the short list for the chemistry club. I'm okay flunking it, actually. He stared at me, his gray eyes getting kind of cold-looking and hard. Girls aren't allowed in the chemist club. Ooh, good to know. Do you not know any languages? That set him off, and he regaled me in Swedish for 10 minutes. Swedish. 10 minutes of my life I could not get back. Bonbons and truffles, although his voice was pretty amazing. After a few minutes, I leaned my head on my hand and just stared at him while he talked until finally, it was time to go. I took my time because apparently I was going to do community service, take a ride in a car with Drake, and somehow make it stick that I did not want to go to a dance with him, however many gingerbread houses he made for me. The idea of going to a dance, of dancing with him like just standing and kind of moving to music without him having his hand on my thigh, holding me above his head while I tried not to flap my flamingo wings. Well, it had some appeal. Of course it had appeal. The boy was absolutely delicious. His whole scent and body and voice and everything. That was the point. If he was just the voice or just the body or just the scent, then maybe I could go with him and not end up killing myself or ruining my life over him. I shook my head furiously and noticed a guy staring at me like I was crazy. I am kind of crazy, I told him, which made him back off. I sighed and kept walking until I got to the green Suburban where Drake wasn't. Were we going to meet in my room? I took my phone out of my bag, but I didn't actually have his number in it. I didn't have anyone's at school. No numbers besides Revere and Poppy's. I hit her contact number and saw her face. A close-up of her eyes, all big and manga-looking. There you are. Are you ready to go? I fumbled, clicking off the picture before I smiled up at Drake. Yeah. Were we supposed to meet here? I couldn't remember, and I don't have your number. What's yours? I shrugged. I don't know. He touched his phone to mine. There was a little beep, and he grinned at me. You do now. Or rather, I have yours, and I will call you. He pressed a button, and my phone beeped. I stared at my phone for a little while before I pushed the phone icon. Hello? He put his phone to his ear, and I got to hear him in stereo. Hello. This is Drake Huntsman of the Huntsmans. What can I do for you? Do you think it's weird that the phone icon looks nothing like phones look anymore? I had not thought about that. How long are you going to stare at me and talk on your phone? I shrugged. It's kind of fun. I hate talking on the phone. I smiled at him. Really? So this bothers you? His eyebrow flickered, and he leaned closer to me. It's ridiculous. Only you could make something I hate so interesting. He hung up, tossed his phone in his bag, and got in the Suburban. Are you going to ride in the back? I shook my head and went around to the passenger side, sliding my phone in my bag and getting in. I acted fine and calm while I adjusted my chair, pulling on my seatbelt. But when he held out his hand, I grabbed his arm, hanging onto it like we were watching a horror movie. He smiled, shaking his head as he shifted into gear and pulled out. He drove quickly but much more smoothly, almost like he was trying not to freak me out or something. You grab onto me like you like me. I pressed my lips together as he turned the steering wheel, following the curves of the road. The force sent me into the door, and I clung to him tighter. Drake, I do like you as a friend, but I'm not comfortable going to the dance with you. I don't like you like that. Bonbons, truffles, peanut brittle. It would be clearer if I slammed his face against the steering wheel and leapt out of the car. That would give him the message much better than me clinging to him desperately. All right, although I already ordered the costumes. Costumes? You think I would joke about something like lederhosen? Never. Have you ever been to a dance? Have you ever kissed a guy? Held a hand because you like someone, not because you were scared to death? I shook my head and swallowed down nausea. He was driving so fast. No, I did like this guy once. He was Italian and really ugly, but he'd call me cara mia when he asked me to sign for packages. Sign for packages? You had a crush on the delivery guy? I nodded. I used to wait on the porch roof to see the dust of his truck on the road. I'd give him a glass of whiskey and he'd tell me a story about goblins or ghosts. And he winked at me. How long did that last? I shrugged. A different delivery guy started coming, a woman who couldn't get my name right. Penny Lane isn't exactly hard to pronounce, and she wasn't from a different country, so what was her excuse? So you like to sit around drinking whiskey and telling stories with Italian delivery guys. Good to know. And what about you? Who was your first crush? He wrinkled his forehead. Marta. She was the housekeeper's daughter. She wasn't supposed to come to the house. Sometimes when my dad was away on long trips, Heloise would bring her and we'd get into trouble. We colored an entire wall with permanent markers one day when we were old enough to know better. She didn't come. After that, and neither did Heloise. I gripped the seat while this weird feeling descended on my intestines. I swallowed down the double nausea. Do you remember her last name? He gave me a suspicious glance. Why? I squeezed his hand tighter. I should let him drive with both hands, but I couldn't. That's so romantic. You can be like Prince Charming, only you'll need to use a different car because this isn't a Prince Charming car. And you can swoop her off her feet and carry her to a castle fair, far away from her dreary life sweeping floors. Let's find her and... No, he pulled his hand out of my grip, holding his palm in front of my face before I recaptured it. You can say, Marta, it's been too long, but you still have the eyes of the girl I first loved. And she can say, I never thought you noticed me, but I always loved you from afar. She told me she hated me and kicked my shins until I agreed to color the walls with her. And then you can sweep her into your arms and gaze into her eyes. Oh, Marta, you are the stars twinkling in the sky and the rose petals strewn across my bed. And then she'll say, rose petals strewn across my bed? You mean like chopping her up and spreading her around on my blankets? Like that? I ignored his interruption. She'll say, Antonio, you light my way through the darkness. Let us be one tonight. Who is Antonio? And then you'll clasp her to your breast. Martina, you are my flower, but there was an accident in Guatemala and I am only half a man. You must be gentle with me. And then she'll say, what do you mean I'm only half a man? You'd better be talking about Antonio. By that time, we were swinging into the hospital parking lot, and I managed not to bolt out of the car before he braked. I let go of his hand and shot out of the door, slamming it behind me and leaning against it while my heart pounded. I slid down until I wrapped my arms around my bare knees. I should have changed, but I didn't have a lot of clothes. Yeah, I should think about what I was going to sew. I should order some cute pink and floral fabric, along with more shoes, and forget about the churning in my stomach. Drake leaned against the car beside me. Aren't you going to have a lollipop? I took a deep, trembling breath. You put something weird in them. I should be home making lollipops. Baini wants tiramisu. Are you taking orders? I haven't actually had anything like tiramisu or mulled cider, just the weird ones you eat for anxiety. Are you saying that you don't like my lollipops? I turned my head to look up at him. I stood slowly until I could look in his eyes. For your first batch of lollipops, it's incredible. It's typical that you're so disgustingly talented. Gingerbread houses, lollipops, laundry, even ballet. There really isn't anything you can't do. I can't sew. I smiled at him. You'll have to work on that. Are you going to stand here all night, or are we going to go clean up vomit? After we spent our time in the hospital, I rode in the back seat to the Chinese place, eating in separate booths again, and then going back to get a malt and drive home. I sat behind him, spooning cookie dough malt into my face and staring at the back of Drake's head and his ear. We need to learn sign language. His voice was low, kind of growly. You don't know something besides sewing? Stop, Drake. You're really bending my whole conception of reality. Don't you think the waiter gave us weird looks when we went in together and sat at different booths again? Not at all. When you tried to pay, did the guy tell you that your woman paid for it? That was the highlight of last week's trip. Your man paid. He grunted. If I was your man, I wouldn't sit in a separate booth, at opposite ends of the restaurant. Don't you think that you should sit in front and cling to me, for the sake of exposure to fears so that you can overcome them? I almost put my hand on his shoulder just for a second before I pulled back and ate another bite of malted, concentrating on the deliciousness. But unfortunately, that was the flavor that Drake had licked off me. I put the spoon in the cup and put it in the cup holder in the door. I took a deep breath and took my headphones out of my bag. I put them on and listened to Chinese. Drake glanced back at me, frowning, while I gave him a mild smile. I didn't want to think about holding on to his hand or gingerbread houses or knit shirts and tea parties. When we pulled up at school, Drake got out quickly, opening the back door and grabbing my bag, so I had to move fast since I was connected via headphones. He pulled off my headphones, put them on his head, and then scowled at me before he shook his head. Really? This is what you listen to? I sighed. I know. Spanish dramas are so much better, but the teacher isn't impressed with my conversational skills if I'm not talking about something boring, so... He pulled out the device and flipped through it, pushing little buttons on it until he seemed satisfied, listening until he took off the headphones and put them on my head. I smiled when a man and woman started screaming at each other in Chinese about. She caught him cheating on her with her cousin. The wedding is next week, and she already sent out invitations. Come on, Penny. I'll walk you to your room while you immerse yourself in something you can appreciate. The next morning, I got out of bed and felt kind of bouncy without any lollipops, without anything besides the headphones I'd fallen asleep to. Racy, scenes in Chinese that I had no idea where Drake found. I wore the headphones through the halls, listening while people bumped me, knocked me, pulled my hair. In English, I took them off at the door, tucking them in my bag as I went to my seat. Penny, how was the hospital? I smiled at Whitley and her ravishing hair. It's always really satisfying to serve the community. How was your evening? Well, I did shots with a few friends and watched some movies. You should come party sometime when you're not off doing good. I sighed sadly. I'm afraid I'm always off doing good. She smiled widely, her perfect teeth straight beneath her lush lips. You're an inspiration, Penny Lane. I imagine you're so busy doing good to Drake. Lucky boy. I inhaled and licked my lips. Some would say I'm the one who's lucky. Her lips twisted in a parody of a smile. I always wanted a lucky Penny. Have fun with Drake, but be careful. The boy has sharp teeth. I opened my mouth to say something about how I liked his teeth and instead turned and marched to my seat against the wall. Talking to that girl got me into trouble. I didn't want bonbons. I wanted fireballs, the kind that would leave an ashy green residue on her perfect skin. What compounds would it take to create something the perfect balance between flame and ash? I hadn't thought about that kind of herder for a long time, not since Poppy. I shook my head and concentrated on my English, but at the same time, I was thinking about ratios of phosphorus to magnesium. In linguistics, I got to see Zach's shock when I confronted him in Chinese about impregnating my grandmother and demanded 500 tulips for repayment. His answer was a little too complicated for me, something about how he'd thought it was me in the dark and he would marry me if I would raise the child as my own and start a flower business together, named after dear Grandma. The girl who was pouring tea had a scandalized expression on her face through our conversation, but I thought it went well. "Miss Lane, your accent has improved," was all the instructor Ms. had to say. The day progressed without anything out of the ordinary happening, and in business, Drake sat beside me when he came in class, and even though he spent the whole time on his computer, he looked at me and raised an eyebrow once which made my stomach do the butterfly thing, and me want to kick myself for staring at him so blatantly. In history, I sat by Viney and turned to her immediately. "Let's go shopping on Saturday. I need help. I've never really worn a bra before. And jeans, is it hard to buy jeans?" She rolled her eyes before she leaned her chin on her fist. "Jeans are the worst. Actually, bras are terrible too. Fine. We'll go because if you order something, it will turn out wrong and then our date will be completely messed up. I have a few guys selected. Upperclassmen that seemed vaguely interesting. We'll go play pool and eat. Low pressure kind of thing for your first date." "I don't swim." She rolled her eyes and patted my head like I was an idiot. At least she didn't yank out some more of my hair. "Not that kind of pool. Billiards cue, 8-ball, are those familiar terms in your bizarre vocabulary?" "Ah." "We're going to shoot some pool." "I've never done that before. Do you think there will be a bar fight?" "Only if Drake is there." "We should bring him then." "I've never been to a bar fight." She snorted. "You can go bar fighting with Drake some other time. This is a date. No bar fights on dates." "Page 47, Professor Vale said," her eyes shooting daggers at the two of us. Viney glared back at her, but I gave her a meek smile and opened my book.
Chapter 25. Mage. I was in business class with Penny when I got the email. I opened it, scanned the contents, and quickly closed it. She didn't notice anything. She was frowning at the book we were reading for class, marking up the text with a pink marker. What was she thinking about? She never said what she actually thought, keeping everything close to her like I would steal her thoughts and leave her empty. Could I do that? Probably, but that wouldn't leave room in my head for my own. Not that my thoughts were very interesting lately. I kept going round and round with the room thing. Everything pointed to the obvious conclusion: Jackson destroying Penny's room. But it made no sense. Rather, it made all the sense, and Jackson wasn't that rational. For him to plan to break into Penny's room, there had to be something he wanted. Her trunks were impervious to violence and force, so heavily spelled that no one without her family's blood could open them. I'd seen inside 2 of them, and there hadn't been anything noticeably precious other than hat-making supplies and elaborate tea party costumes. The tapestries were priceless, several mangled beyond even my ability to repair them. That made me angry, also confused. Jackson would know their value and steal them, not destroy them. He knew that I wouldn't allow him to touch Penny Lane. Neither of us knew why, but my reaction in the cafeteria when he'd grabbed her hand made it pretty clear to both of us. If he hadn't gotten wit, he would be in traction for a very long time. Jackson didn't like traction. Why would he risk that? I shook my head and smiled at Penny before leaving her behind and heading towards the stables. This assignment would be good for me, help clear my head, or fill it with noxious fumes. I grinned as I donned my leather riding outfit and heavy cloak, then stepped from this world into Darkside. After I took care of business in the military camp at the base of the mountain, I took one step back into Dayside, then returned to the ash-filled air of the mountain city above the camp. I stepped out from the dark alley and walked down the narrow street that tilted, so I walked like a drunken man. Darksiders sulked around me, heavy cloaks covering their heads and large shoulders. It was a witch city, but with the war going on, there was heavy traffic of all kinds. I raised my head to look at the fortress carved into the protruding rock above the city. That's where he'd be. I didn't have any business in that fortress, but when I'd stumbled on his location, I couldn't pass up the occasion for a good chat. I walked up the streets closer and closer to the fortress until I found a wizard's square. In other words, gold was embedded in the stone, patterns of stars within stars, twined together, framed by 5 gnarled trees at each point between streets. I stepped into the exact center of those stars and cast a spell. My body flared green, star shapes coming to life over my skin in a neon flash, before I vanished and reappeared inside a room. I took 2 steps in the dim light, barely lit from glowing coals in the hearth, tripped over a body, and caught myself on the edge of a table. "Light, please." At my words, candles flashed bright all around, then dimmed as they began burning according to nature, at least nature in Darkside. Instead of gray stone, it was a charming collection of gold and burgundy veneer with heavy drapes and thick rugs behind the scroll-footed Chesterfield couch. On every flat surface, graceful glass bottles rested with large glasses. I didn't need to see the bottles. I could smell a drunken spree as well as anyone. I ignored the body and went to the table, picked up a bottle of cobalt blue and maroon with swirls of gold, uncapped it, then poured the contents into a glass, bubbles spinning around like a little whirlpool as I recapped the lid and carried the glass to the couch. I sat down, leaned back, sniffed the contents, then shook my head. Music. It took some concentration, but soon the trumpets of a big band filled the room, followed by a crooning voice that soothed even more than the burnished gold in my glass. I took a sip and winced. Ian certainly liked to brew his elixirs strong. Speaking of Ian, he stirred, raising up 2 inches and turning his head, face covered in long, golden, filthy strands of hair. "Nice boots. They're yours if you want them. I don't remember if my feet are larger than yours." "They were the same size last time I checked." I undid my laces and kicked them off, revealing my socks in the rosewood argyle pattern. Green and gold. Ian sat up, leaning one arm on a knee, and squinted at me. Dim. The candles all responded to his command, leaving us in shadowy darkness. "What is this? Frank Sinatra?" His voice was raspy. "Sammy Davis Jr." "Don't tell me you drink in silence. It's not healthy. How are you supposed to drown out the demons without music?" He snorted and grabbed the glass out of my hand. He threw it back, gasped, and choked. His eyes watered while he stared at me, face turning an interesting shade of purple, while I tapped my fingers on the arm of the couch, raising the light level to somewhere between bright and dim. "What was that poison?" he gasped. I'd changed the liquid while he complimented my boots. He would never mention something personal if he wasn't in desperate need of sobriety. "Jasper makes it for me. I believe he calls it natural consequences, but there's not very much nature in it." He breathed shallowly, in and out, before he sprang to his feet and dashed to the closet where he kept the plumbing. He threw up for a long time, getting the alcohol out of his system. Good. He might be coherent in a few minutes. While I waited for him, I went to the table and poured myself another glass of golden death. When Ian came out, his hair was damp, his face washed along with his hands. His clothing was still stained and frankly revolting. He'd been having a very good time. "How did you find me?" I raised an eyebrow as I leaned back, enjoying the crackling fire in the hearth mixed with the music. I had to release someone. That explains the blood. I frowned, then followed his glance down to the glass where I'd left faintly pink fingerprints. I put down the glass and pulled out a handkerchief, the one with a rose embroidered in the corner. I hesitated before I wiped my fingers on the white fabric. You still have some of those left? Ian smiled slightly as he went to a large carafe and poured himself some water. He leaned on the edge of the sturdy table, sipping and watching me over the rim. I smirked at him. He looked like a darksider, but he remembered the hours we'd spent in detention embroidering handkerchiefs. Yes, I have 3 remaining. 2. One isn't currently in my possession. He raised an eyebrow. But you intend to retrieve it? I shrugged. Eventually. How are things? He laughed, a short bark that made me a little more wary than I already was. I sank deeper into the couch and crossed my legs. Are you here to interfere? I smiled at him, showing my teeth. I told you why I'm here. He raised an eyebrow. Really? You just dropped by for a chat? I nodded. Yes, actually. I thought I'd invite you back. We're having Blackheart for Midfest tourney, and we could use you, but probably not in your current condition. He growled at me. I smiled back until he turned and gripped the table with his fingers. Finally, he gulped down an enormous container of water. He slammed it down on the table, and I tossed him an apple. He caught it, rolled it around in his hands before he gave me a flat glare and took a large bite out of it. I exhaled while he chewed. I'd been patient with Ian for a long time. I was getting bored. He strode to the fire and stirred it with the poker before turning towards me. He'd put the poker down, also boring. What did you release him for? I shrugged. It was time. 138 years of service is a long while, even for Huntsman Inc. to keep a darksider sane. He turned on his companions, took out an even dozen before he was neutralized. A rager? I nodded. Did you personally release him? I smiled, showing my teeth. I did. I could still smell the reeking darksider, the blood, sweat, and death that clung to him like an already rotting corpse. 2 enormous men held him up between them, the soldier's eyes empty of reason, humanity oozing blood and something else. Poos, probably. Is Jasper here with you? Ian's voice was careful, eyes wary. I smiled. No one is here with me. You ended a rager without any assistance? Do you have any injuries? I sighed. It had been far too long since I'd seen Ian. He was acting like he didn't know me at all. I took a long, slow sip of the golden liquid in the cup while I closed my eyes, reliving my most recent release. I'd pulled out the printout from inside my shirt, ran my fingers around the edges of the still mostly white paper with a name and number on it. Horace Bellbody? The creature between the 2 men stared at me, oozing. I could hear his breath, rattling through him like an old air conditioner. I release you from the service of Huntsman Incorporated. Thank you for your noble service. I ripped the paper in half down the middle, a fast tear that went through the creature like I'd just ripped him. He threw his head back and screamed, throwing off the 2 men like they were bowling pins, and rushed me, breaking through the chains like paper. Sparks filled my vision before he struck me, magic filling the air and my throat with a pungent aroma of jasmine. With one half of the torn paper, I decapitated him using the side with his name printed in neat black letters, well, now smeared red. The other side of the paper I expanded into an explosion of white confetti attached to strands of green, shielding me from the furious magic before I folded it out and over the specks of wild magic until it was contained in one neat package. I'd always been good with origami. Ian cleared his throat and I opened my eyes. He still stood at the table, frowning from beneath his stringy hair. I love what you've done with your hair. It reminds me of Lester. He's left the chemise to join the Philosophia. Ian gave me a tiny nod. I don't remember you being such a good listener. If you continue with your charming silence, I'll be forced to regale you with tales of Rosewood. He cocked his head, and he smiled slightly before he took a deep, even breath of the noxious dark side air. It's the pull. It's unbearable when I'm conscious. She doesn't want me in dark side. I winced and curled my lips. Ah, the divine Whitley misses her golden dragon. Golden goose. I shook my head. She would never kill you. She's far too practical for that. He scowled at me, then laughed and dropped down on the couch beside me, a boneless flop that left him staring at the ceiling. True enough. How did you find me? I heard that my mercenaries are fighting a war over a pretty dragon lord. I have to thank you for the business. I expected you to be wrapped in the arms of a witch. He closed his eyes. She's leading the charge against Halistia. I haven't seen a witch for days. I think that they've forgotten all about me. Poor Ian. Nothing to do but drink by yourself. I'm so glad I dropped by. I love being useful. He opened his eyes and stared at me. His head still lolled back before his nostrils flared, and he sniffed deeply. What flavor of witch are you wearing? She's lovely. I growled before I remembered that I was supposed to be a human or something. Nothing. That is, there are so many females, how can I know which scent you're catching? He raised a golden eyebrow, the most seductive look in his repertoire. I should feel flattered that he was using it on me, but he wasn't. He was aiming it at the female he'd caught scent of. Ian was like that, couldn't help it. Sugar and blood, semi-sweet chocolate. No, chocolate is all wrong. Sweet and fluffy candy canes? No, not peppermint. I threw myself off the couch and away from him, taking my place at the table where he'd been not long before. It's lollipops, not candy canes, and strawberries, not chocolate. Also, she's mine, and I will kill you if you touch her. His eyes flickered gold at that challenge, but he only raised his eyebrows for a moment before smirking. You've fallen for a witch? The mighty Drake Huntsman who swore that he would never be a pathetic slave like his friends has finally tasted the poison of love? I gripped the edge of the table and scowled at my boots where they were strewn over the floor. I wouldn't call it love. He laughed, a wild, delightful sound that was like golden bells. He'd definitely been in Darkside too long if he sounded like that. She has your handkerchief. Which one? I scowled at him before I went to the fireplace and jabbed it a few times with the poker. Flames roared from my energy more than the poker, swirling orange and gold mixing with green flames and sparks. It's not like that. I am protecting her from the other witches. It's my hatred for them which brings us together, not my attraction towards her. But there is attraction? No, she's probably hideously ugly, cruel, a true beast. Strawberry golden curls past her waist, legs like a sylph, hands. I snarled at him. I'd actually fallen for his baiting like a completely instinct-controlled imbecile. He laughed again and leaned forward over his knees, eyes bright and burning. Do you want me to kill her for you? She doesn't possess you yet, does she? I swallowed and held very still. Was this why I'd come to Ian? To help me escape my growing fascination for Penny Lane? No, never. Never possess you or never kill her? I poured myself a drink with shaking hands. I should say both. I had to say both, but the idea of owned by Penny Lane had been slithering around the back of my mind ever since I'd threatened to bind myself to her. There were distinct advantages to it. She could challenge Whitley, I could fight for her, and then we could free Ian. Would she ever agree to that? She hated Wit, instinctively and at first sight. Wit had tried to be charming, friendly, but Penny barely kept from snarling at every encounter. If Penny saw Ian as a poor, wounded animal that she had to nurse back to health, I scowled at Ian. His reputation was even worse than mine, which was saying something. It wasn't only his reputation. He tried to seduce every virgin he'd ever met. It wasn't his fault, not entirely, but that didn't change the reality. If he seduced Penny, I would break him. No one is going to hurt Penny. He curled his lips in a delighted smile. I'll drink to that. I'm so glad you stopped by. As a poor wounded animal that she had to nurse back to health. I scowled at Ian. His reputation was even worse than mine, which was saying something. It wasn't only his reputation. He tried to seduce every virgin he'd ever met. It wasn't his fault, not entirely, but that didn't change the reality. If he seduced Penny, I would break him. No one is going to hurt Penny. He curled his lips in a delighted smile. I'll drink to that. I'm so glad you stopped by.
Darkly Sweet, Chapter 26. Which? Saturday came quickly. My life was a blur of studying, mixing potions, making lollipops, and going to classes. I got up, dressed in my cute, freshly sewn pink blouse with little heart cutouts beneath the neckband. The floral skirt was a little bit longer than usual, because I was hanging out with Vine, not Zach, whose love key I still hadn't cracked. When I came out, Viney was sitting at a table, slumped over, looking haggard, even her glare at me lackluster. She sipped from her steaming cup of coffee. You look great, but a little bit tired. Oh, you must have been up all night with the sorority club. What was it called? Famis. Ma kiss. Who told you about that? She snarled at me and had a bit more energy as I plopped down beside her. Zach, last Friday you were howling like wolves. I thought we were under attack. She almost went out to sea, wearing her stunning lace robe. Zach smiled at me, his eyes twinkling a little bit as he sat down with his own cup of coffee. I fiddled with my skirt hem. Coffee was not food, and that much caffeine on an empty stomach would turn me into a homicidal weasel. I'll go get some breakfast and be right back. I brought food, enough even for you, hungry girl. Drake's voice wafted around me, almost as delicious as the scent of bacon. I inhaled deeply, clasping my hands to my heart. Drake, I nominate you for a promotion. What's his current position? Zach looked up at me from his cup of coffee. By the door. I patted the chair beside me. How did you know that I was craving bacon? Drake grinned at me, his green eyes glimmering beneath the fall of his auburn hair that looked genuinely mussed and not very stylish. It's my job to know and give you everything you crave. My stomach tightened, and those butterflies fluttered around. But maybe that was just because I was starving. I resisted the urge to grab his arm and pull him down as he laid out breakfast from the bags he carried. Are you trying to be slow? He turned his head and his mouth was inches from mine. It's also my job to drive you crazy before I give you satisfaction. I sighed breathily, leaning even closer to him until I was dizzy with his black cherry scent. If only I wasn't crazy already. Oh, that reminds me. I got up and went to my room, flipping my skirt kind of ridiculously in hopes that someone was looking at my legs. Besides Viney, I came back with a bag I'd sewn a russet weasel to the front of and held it out for Drake. He was sitting at the table at that point and took it with a puzzled glance. What is this? I handed a bag to Viney, black with skulls, and Zach, an applique of his favorite video game bad guy. I made lollipops. I know it's not much, but it's my thank you for all your help with my room. The red ones are raspberry, the dark brown tiramisu, light brown mulled cider, and the dark purple ones are. I gave Drake a sidelong glance before I beamed at Zach and Viney. Anyway, that's what's in the bags. They all looked in the bags, and Viney immediately unwrapped one of the dozen of tiramisu ones and popped it in her mouth. She sucked on it and drank her coffee at the same time. The girl was going to have a heart attack. Drake pulled me down on my chair. Enough. Lollipop girl, eat before your eggs get cold. I beamed at him. You sound like a grumpy grandpa. Drake, you would be such a cute grumpy grandpa. I hope that you have 50 grandkids and they all have your red hair and green eyes. I focused on eating and didn't notice everyone staring at me for a long time. I shook my head and gave Drake a pointed look. See, so uncomfortable when people stare at me while I eat. Zach laughed. I think we're staring at you because you just offered to give Drake 10 children. I cocked my head while I analyzed my last sentence. I did not. Who else has the right genetics to give Drake red-headed kids? Your hair is light red. I felt suddenly sick. I gripped the edge of the table and stared at the half-eaten muffin crumbling across my plate. Zach, you're such an idiot. You're going to make her faint again. You know that Drake freaks her out. She can't even go to a dance with him without losing it. I smiled at Viney. It's fine. I just ate too quickly, or Drake poisoned the food, or the thought of having 10 kids, kind of. Drake put a hand on my shoulder, gripping it tightly. I don't want any kids. My parents sucked, and I'll probably be even worse than they were. If you have 10 kids, it won't be with me. I nodded, but I'd lost my appetite. After that, I left Lilac Stories with Viney and climbed into the back of a limo to go shopping. Wow. Bonbons and truffles, ding-dongs and ho-hos. Not that I'd ever had ding-dongs or ho-hos. I tried on 100 pairs of jeans to find 2 that were perfect, both of them so close in style I couldn't tell the difference. Bras were worse. Viney sat outside the changing room and had me model various bras like a general, ordering me to turn and bend over and jump up and down. I ended up with a dozen bra, one of which she insisted I wear right away, but it made my clothes fit wrong. It kind of pushed everything out and up, and who knew I had anything to push out and up? The bra lady measured me. Not like that wasn't ridiculously awkward. I sucked on a dirt-flavored lollipop desperately while the stranger wrapped her measuring tape around my chest and said how lucky I was not to have to get a serious jogging bra. Viney kept eating tiramisu lollipops. She was going through those at a crazy speed. It made me smile to see her walking around with her black skull bag that I'd made for her. When she dragged me into the salon, I kind of freaked out because I was not chopping off all my hair, however loud Viney got. I agreed to 1 inch off the bottom, and then they straightened my hair. Not permanently, but it still took 45 minutes while Viney sucked on lollies and read magazines. I listened to my Chinese while the poor woman given the task to tame my mane struggled with the beast. By the time we climbed into the back of the limo that would take us to school, I looked a lot more like the other mall shoppers than when I'd gone in. We only had a few hours before the guy's Vine was setting us up with a ride to take us to Fairfield, and the cool hangout I'd never been to. Back at Lilac Stories, Zach and Drick were sitting on the couch playing guitars. Aren't you losers doing anything today? Viney walked past them with her shopping bags while I inhaled deeply and my pushed-up breasts shoved against my blouse. No breathing. What happened to your hair? Zach stared at me while Drake kept strumming, keeping his attention on his fingers while they plucked strings. He was incredibly good. Zach had not taught him to play that quickly. Do you like it? I swished my hair, and it actually swished across my arms, not just puffing out like normal. He stared at me for a little while before he nudged Drake. Drake glanced up at me, his green gaze catching mine like a tractor beam. It's nice. I personally prefer Tangled with Leaves, but I have eclectic tastes. Black cherry. He stuck his tongue out and I saw the color stained on it. Apparently he'd eaten a few of those. I bit my lower lip and edged away from him. It's not quite right. I think it needs a little bit of blood or something. Anyway, I've got to get changed. I hurried to my room and flung myself on my bed, sending it rocking while my head spun, and I unwrapped a black cherry lollipop. I closed my eyes and enjoyed being alone until Viney pounded on my door. Put on the uncomfortable bra and jeans. And one of the t-shirts. Don't forget your heels. Like I wasn't tall enough. Bonbons and eclairs, I muttered as I rolled off my bed. I changed quickly, pausing in front of the full-length mirror to check out the new and improved me. My hair swished. Really, really long without any curl, almost to my knees like it had been coated in pitch. Maybe I should chop it all off. Poppy and I had sworn that we'd never cut our hair. I shook my head and put on another coat of pink lipstick and dark brown mascara before I grabbed my new denim jacket and walked out of my room. Viney scowled at me. You took long enough, but at least you look normal. Doesn't she? She turned to glare at Zach and Drake. Drake still sat on the couch, plucking strings faster and faster, his fingers mesmerizing before he looked up and flashed me a smile that froze as he really looked at me in my skin-tight jeans and perfect shirt that showed off how my breasts were now unnaturally round and stick-outy. The t-shirt had a character from Zach's favorite video game. Was he paying attention? I turned around and beamed at him. I am not going to tell you how many pairs of pants Viney made me try on. She has more stamina than I imagined possible. Viney snorted. You're the one who kept me hopped up on lollipops. That reminds me I need more. Zach, say something positive. Hard to believe, but Penny is nervous about wearing pants. Zach blinked and nodded before giving me a slight smile. Your jeans are nice. Your legs look nice, too. Drake slugged his shoulder. Not nice. Zach, edible, tantalizing, exquisite, desirable, sensual. Zach's linguist brain kicked in. Libidinous, alluring, provocative, arousing, tempting, titillating. I giggled a little bit. The jeans were working. Thanks, Zach. You look practically normal, Drake said, giving me a wink before focusing back on the strings. Something about the way he said that made me feel kind of stupid. Viney was shooting for normal, but he was saying even with a complete makeover, I still didn't make the cut. Thanks. I guess I'll see you guys later. Call if there's a problem. Drake didn't look up, but his lips tightened. I nodded, staring at him, his hair falling over his face while he stared at the strings. He'd brought me breakfast. Maybe I should have picked up something for him at the mall. Probably not a bra. Viney grabbed my arm and we were off. A silver car waited in front of the pillars at the bottom of the steps, and two guys stood looking drop-dead everything. They both smiled at Viney and kind of knocked over themselves opening the front and back door, like she needed options. She nodded at them and slid into the back seat. I bumped past the black-haired guy, sliding in beside her instead of ending up in front. Not a chance. Viney gave me a weird look and I smiled back at her. This is going to be so fun. That's right. We're so excited that you called, Vaneldra. The black-haired guy spoke in a well-modulated voice that could have oiled a car. And that you brought your friend. The blonde one looked at me with a gorgeous smile that didn't touch his eyes. And that was the last time anyone looked or talked to me for the rest of the night. The two jumped over themselves to open doors for Viney or Vaneldra, complimented her, made interesting conversation about fascinating topics that were sure to interest her, but didn't. And in short, dated her while I got to go along for the ride. I couldn't really complain because it was seriously amusing to watch Viney's suitors vie for her reluctant hand. Darkly Sweet, Chapter 27. We were in booths. The guy across from me trying to subtly put his arm behind Viney, and the guy next to me leaning across the table, gazing into her eyes, or at least he would be if she bothered looking away from her phone. I ate, but then they were talking, and I said that I was going to the restroom, and Viney glanced up and nodded. But the two guys didn't seem to hear me, so I went, and as I came out for some reason, I wasn't drawn compulsively back to my fabulous date. I didn't even know which guy was supposed to be my date. I was wearing jeans, and that meant I should play pool or basketball or something. In my heels. Whatever. I wandered over to the pool table, stood back, and watched them play. There were more guys than girls, and the girls were kind of cool, messy hair, jeans, and t-shirt girls who teased the guys, leaning provocatively over the pool table. I had a favorite girl, a redhead in black boots, who flirted and sassed. I clapped along with everyone else when she made a spectacular shot. Do you want to play? I glanced over at the guy who had come to stand next to me, a bottle of golden liquor in his fist. His eyes were brown with golden flecks like his bottle, his hair very short, which showed the sculpted perfection of his head. He was so pretty. His lips weren't too big, but perfectly balanced beneath his straight nose. He was taller than me, even though he slouched in his t-shirt and jeans. I smiled at him and shrugged, focusing back on the players. I was aware that he was watching me, not looking at me like a weird thing, but like guys looked at Whitley. He cleared his throat. I like your t-shirt. Do you play that game? Stupid question. Do you come here often? I glanced over and raised my eyebrow. Are you flirting with me? He smiled slightly. I am. Badly. You make me nervous. He gave me a half-shy, half-teasing smile. I really wished for a lollipop, but it didn't really go with the jeans and t-shirt thing. I settled for smiling down at my hands and wishing I had a bottle in them to hold, or a hand, a drake-shaped hand. This guy was really nice looking. No better than nice, much better. Come on. He handed me a pool cue and turned to an empty table, taking off the black triangle around the balls. I held the cue awkwardly as I slowly eased closer to him. I really did want to play. I wanted to be that cool girl who knew how to make other people laugh. I've never played before. He glanced at me with a raised eyebrow, and I licked my lips because something about the way he looked at me reminded me of black cherry. I wanted to smell black cherry, not his scent. Something sandalwood and citrus. He moved slowly over to me, put his bottle on the edge of the table, and rested his hand on the cue above mine. You hold your hands like this. Can I show you? I nodded and expected him to demonstrate with his cue, not to step behind me and put his arms on either side of me, his hands on my hands and his chest against my back. I swallowed down my innate urge to slam my elbow back into his body when he leaned forward, bending me over the table with the slightest pressure. You slide it through your fingers like this, then strike through your shoulder like so. His voice was low, silk, and his scent more sandalwood than citrus, as he shoved the cue forward and it hit the white ball, sending it into the triangle of balls, which shot out in every direction with a resounding crack. He stepped away from me, giving me a toothy smile before he took a long drink, revealing the perfect column of his throat above his t-shirt, the movement showing the sculpted muscles of his chest beneath the fabric. I blinked away from him, tightening my grip on the stick before I bent over and hit a ball, knocking it a few inches, not the satisfying thud that this guy had done. Your turn. Did I sound flirty and cool or homicidal and terrified? I forced a smile at him, and he half smiled before he turned to the table and did a shot that knocked 3 balls into holes. Pockets. Or was that a billiards term? His arm had a muscle on the back center that flexed as he made the perfect shot. What would Drake's arms look like if he was the one leaning over the pool table, the wooden shaft in his capable hands? My mouth watered as I bent over and focused on making my fingers slidable before I pushed the cue and hit a ball, sending it flying off the table with way too much velocity. The guy moved fast, reaching out to snag the ball before it could hit the cool redhead. He held the ball and studied me, his eyes strangely emotionless. I swallowed, held the pool cue like a weapon. Sorry. Am I disqualified? He glanced down at my fingers like he could tell exactly what they were doing. Excellent trajectory, but I think you're breaking a few rules. You're supposed to keep the balls on the table. Oops. Nice catch. He smiled slowly as he took one step towards me, then another. He put the ball in my hand, pressing my fingers around the sphere. This is just a warm-up. Do you want a drink? What do you like? Whiskey. Why did I say that? He raised an eyebrow and his smile widened while I tried to look calm and not like I wanted to light something on fire and run as fast as I could out of this place. I did not like whiskey. I did not drink whiskey. Drinking me in public was quite possibly the worst idea in the entire world. But he was so pretty, and maybe he wasn't a mage. Maybe he wasn't a mage. Maybe he was a normal guy who wanted to talk to a normal girl in jeans. There you are. I thought you were flushed down the toilet. Viney came up to me, glaring. I glanced from her to the guy. I'm sorry. I should have told you where I was, but I got sucked into watching them play. After that, this guy showed me how to hold a stick. I bet. She whirled around, the whip before the lash. But the guy didn't flinch away from her attack. Instead, he smiled like he found her amusing. Listen, jerkface, before you hit on someone, you should probably... Her voice trailed off as she stared at him, and her expression went from somewhat angry to white and bugged out furious. He smiled at her widely. Have we met? We must have. I get that look a lot. She swelled with visible rage until I took her hand and tugged her away from him. Hey, Viney, let's go get coffee, okay? I saw this cute little shop a few buildings down that I've been meaning to try. The guy's eyes snapped from my face back to hers. Viney, right? It's been a long time. How are things? So he was a mage. No wonder I found him so good-looking. He was probably completely evil, too. Viney swallowed like she was trying to choke down a sack of poodle poop. Ian, it hasn't been long enough. I'm sorry you feel that way. I have nothing but the fondest memories of you. Are you going to introduce me to your friend? The words were a challenge, and Viney was going to accept it with pool cue, him at the end of it. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder and kind of tugged her away from him. Hey, I bet they have tiramisu. My treat. The guy's expression changed as he eyed my arm around her. You're together? Viney inhaled sharply and then bared her teeth at him. Obviously. That's right. We're here on a date. I stared at Viney while her eyes pled with me. Okay. Right. We ate, and I was distracted watching the cool girl. But enough of that. We should get dessert. Viney dragged me away from Ian, who watched us looking amused. He clearly was far less upset at seeing Viney than she was to see him. After we were out the door, Viney shrugged my arm off her shoulder. From all the dressing up you do, I expected more. Wow. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Viney, but that was my first date ever. I kind of got thrown at the end, so he's a mage. That explains it. What? Don't you think that mages have that glowing kind of attractiveness about them? Ian? Alluring? You mean like Drake. Yeah, they're the same kind of mage, but Ian is so far beneath Drake, I can't even. She sputtered and glared at me like I'd talked to Ian on purpose. I took a deep breath. I didn't know how to smooth things over with people. Pets, sure. You just gave them food and spoke in a calm voice. What happened to the guys? Will they notice that we took off? Also, if the point of pretending to be with me was so you wouldn't look stupid for not having a date, wouldn't it be better to show off those two very nice males instead of me? Viney sighed and pulled out her phone, texting rapidly. I put my hands in my pockets and tried to walk normally in the heels. They were stupid, and I was already tall enough. Come on. She hurried me along, her own sensible boots way better for walking than my heels. We stood in line at the cafe, a glass case full of the most delectable desserts, even tiramisu, which made us both exchange glances and smiles. "All right," I smiled. Viney looked a little less grim. After we'd ordered hot chocolate for me, coffee for her, and an entire pan of tiramisu, we settled in a corner. Viney took a big drink of her coffee before scowling at me. "Ian is vile." "Okay." She frowned at me. "He's like Drake, only less particular. That makes him so much worse." "You're right about the allurement. He looks at a girl, and she gets stupid. It's like his superpower. I thought if he knew I was with a girl, he wouldn't use it on me." I studied her while I blew on my hot chocolate. She crouched over her cup of coffee with her eyeliner smudged messily beneath her poky hair. She wasn't pretty like Wit. Why were guys fighting over her? Why was she afraid of Ian? "Okay. In that case, I'm glad you were there." He was really smooth. Her lips tightened, her dark eyes intense as she gazed at me. He used to go to school with us at Rosewood, left in the middle of his sophomore year. He messed around with a lot of girls. He'd make you feel special and beautiful, and then after he got bored with you, just move on. I stared at her. This mysterious Ian guy taking on new depths. So the problem with him is that he made you think that he liked you when he really only liked the conquest. Sounds like Enrique. She frowned at me. "Who?" "From Pastiones. He's a character in a TV show. Never mind. Just not a good guy to date, but the characters really got addicted to him." She wrinkled her cute nose. "Yeah, he made you feel like the only girl in the world for 10 minutes. But no one could keep him, not even Wit." I sighed. So he broke her heart. Maybe that's why she's so. Wit's always been that kind of witch. But yeah. After Ian, she did go kind of bats. Eat. This tiramisu isn't going to eat itself. She didn't have to tell me twice. She did have to tell me to slow down and save her some. Right after Wit broke up with Ian, she dated Drake for a little while. Her lips tightened, and I put a hand over hers while my own jaw clenched. Wit and Drake. I couldn't even. Forget about him. You don't need a man. You are strong and intelligent and beautiful and cool. Besides that, you're more interested in guys who look a little less like an alien. I mean, that kind of symmetry is completely abnormal. I think we should capture him and skin him to make sure he's human." She snickered. "Now that's something I can agree with. How are we going to get back?" She shrugged. I texted Zach. "I'm sorry that this date ended like this. I wanted you to have a normal experience so you could feel more comfortable if you ever were in the position of dating someone real." I stared at her. "Thanks for trying. I appreciate the effort." She sighed. "Yeah, I didn't think the guys would be so lame. Sorry about that." I held up my hands. "No more apologies. It was a fantastic experience. Even if there wasn't a bar fight, there was a sordid affair, a secret identity, a near seduction, and tiramisu." She rolled her eyes. "I'm going to use the restroom before Zach gets here. Watch out for him, okay?" I nodded and sat there, eating tiramisu and pretending that all was right with the world, when Zach stepped in, looking a little bit nervous. Not nearly as beautiful as Ian, which I desperately appreciated. I stood up and waved him over. "Zach, come here before I eat all the tiramisu. My jeans aren't going to fit at this rate." I was too loud, and lots of people looked at me and then did a double take when they realized that sleek-haired jeans and t-shirt girl was Penny Lane, resident weird girl. I wasn't sure how I'd ended up weird when I'd been trying to be adorable and irresistibly cute, so Zach would marry me. Weird was much easier for me than cute. He smiled and nodded, edging through the tables until he got to me. When he reached the table, I held out my fork full of tiramisu, and he opened his mouth, his eyes kind of big, and I realized that I hadn't let him say anything. It was just so nice to see someone who I knew that wasn't so impossibly attractive and evil. He chewed, swallowed, licked the cream off his lips, and smiled at me. "Where is Viney?" I thumbed over my shoulder. "My date is in the toilet." "I don't mean in the toilet, just... Do you know Ian?" His eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his hands on the table. "Ian." I frowned. "Left middle of sophomore year after breaking all the girls' hearts?" He spoke in a flat voice. "Yeah, Ian Featherwell." "He was one of the guys you went out with." I shook my head. "No, he taught me how to shoot pool while our dates flirted with Viney. Apparently, she's really popular with the silver car crowd. Ian is so smooth, I actually bought that hole. I'm shy and awkward. And you're a cute girl. I'm not sure how to talk to Thing. It's a little bit disappointing. I thought my jeans and t-shirt would be more of a hit with real guys." He stared at me. "You don't think he was real?" "No, I mean like non-mages. I've never met any of those." I kind of thought. I shook my head and held out another fork full of tiramisu. Viney came back while he was still chewing. "Let's go." I wrapped the last of the tiramisu in a napkin while Viney stared at me. "For later." She sighed and glared at Zach. "Don't ask." "I don't have to." Heard Ian's in town. "Is he coming back to school?" "That would be a riot." Zach did not sound like it would be a fun kind of riot. More of a violence and death thing. Viney made a rude sound as we walked out of the cafe and crossed the street to where this tiny little red sports car was parked. I stopped, staring at the large windshield and the teeny seats, while Zach opened the door and Viney went around to the other side. "How many seats are there?" Zach smiled at me while he slid into the driver's seat. "It has a back seat. Not a big one, but Viney will fit okay. I get sick if I sit in the front." Zach frowned. "Like motion sickness? Isn't that usually the opposite, that people in the back get more sick?" I climbed over him and into the back where Viney already sat. "Get off me. Your legs are too long to be back here. What is wrong with you?" I gave her a demure smile and tried to keep my knees to myself. I looked up and saw Ian standing on the sidewalk, watching our whole thing. He nodded when he noticed me, gave me a slight smile, then turned away. He smiled like a wolf, like Drake.